Nora Calloway had exactly 3 minutes before her father came back inside, and she used every one of them to stand at the kitchen window and stare at the flat, dry land that stretched out behind their house, like something that had given up trying to be beautiful a long time ago. The sun was already pressing hard against the earth, even though it was barely 8 in the morning, and the dust near the fence line moved in slow, lazy circles that went nowhere. She watched it the way a person watches something when they are not really seeing it at all, her eyes on the land, her mind already running ahead to what was coming. Earl Calloway's truck door slammed outside. She heard his boots on the porch steps. She turned from the window and went back to the stove. Earl came through the door the way he always did, without knocking, without pausing, without any of the small social courtesies that other men used to fill the space between themselves and the people they lived with. He was a tall man, not heavy but solid, the kind of solid that comes from decades of physical work rather than any deliberate effort. His hands were the most telling thing about him. They were large and cracked and permanently stained along the knuckles with something that no amount of soap had ever fully removed. He had worked this land since he was 14 years old, and the land had marked him the way it marks everything it touches, permanently, and without apology. He set his hat on the hook by the door, poured himself coffee without offering any to Nora, and sat down at the table. He unfolded the newspaper that he had picked up from the end of the drive and spread it out flat, but he did not read it. He stared at the top of the page for a moment, and then he looked up at Nora's back. "Dale Hargrove is coming for supper tonight," he said. Nora stirred the oatmeal. She did not turn around. "All right," she said. "You'll wear something decent." "I always wear something decent." Earl turned a page of the newspaper, though he still was not reading it. "He's a good man," he said, as though this were an answer to a question Nora had not asked. "Steady. Got more land than anyone in this county besides the Perrys. Takes care of what's his." Nora poured the oatmeal into 2 bowls and brought them to the table. She sat across from her father. She picked up her spoon. The oatmeal was plain. They did not have brown sugar that week, and they were nearly out of everything else too, though neither of them mentioned that. "He's also 26 years older than me," Nora said, very quietly. The way she had learned to say things she knew would not go well. Low, careful, with no edge in her voice that could be grabbed and used against her. Earl looked at her. He had gray eyes that had once, according to her mother before she passed, been quite striking. Now, they were simply the eyes of a man who had made up his mind about most things and did not welcome the effort of changing course. "Age is a number," he said. "Stability is not." Nora did not respond to that. She ate her oatmeal and watched the wall behind her father's head and thought about the word stability, which her father used the way some people use the word love, as a reason for things, a justification for decisions, a door closed on any further conversation. She had been born in this house. The house sat on the eastern edge of Delwood, which was a town so small that the gas station also served as the hardware store and the post office, and the woman who ran the beauty parlor was also the notary public and everyone's informal therapist. There were 412 people in Delwood, according to the last official count, though that number had been declining slowly for years, as young people left for the cities and never came back. The ones who stayed were the ones who had land, or the ones who had nowhere else to go, or the ones who could not imagine a life that looked different from the one they already knew. Earl Calloway was all 3 of those things. Nora was only the second one, and even that was not entirely true, because she could imagine something different. She had been imagining it for years. She just had no clear sense of what it looked like, or how to get there. And in Delwood, the distance between imagining a different life and actually reaching one felt roughly the same as the distance between their back porch and the horizon. Visible, technically, but not something you could walk to in an afternoon. Her mother, Clara, had died when Nora was 11 years old. Pneumonia that came on fast and refused to leave, the doctor said. And there was a brief, terrible week that Nora still could not think about directly, only around the edges, the way you look at something very bright without quite looking at it. After Clara died, the house had changed. It did not become cruel exactly. It became quiet, in a way that felt permanent, as though someone had removed something weight-bearing from the structure, and now everything stood, but you were not entirely sure it would continue to do so. Earl did not grieve loudly. He grieved by working. He was up before sunrise every morning for a year after Clara died, and he came in after dark, and in between those hours he built fence lines and repaired machinery, and moved cattle from one pasture to another, and did everything that needed doing on the 340 acres that were all that remained of what had once been a much larger Callaway holding. The land had been sold off piece by piece over 2 generations to cover debts and taxes and the ordinary disasters that come to farming families in dry country, and what was left was enough to keep them fed, but not enough to keep them comfortable. And the line between those 2 states was a very thin one, in years when the rain did not come. Nora had learned to cook when she was 11. She had learned to keep accounts at 12. She had learned to negotiate with the feed supplier at 14, because her father would not drop the price, but she could, with enough patience and politeness, usually get them an extra week on the payment. She had learned these things not because anyone sat her down and taught them to her, but because they needed to be done, and she was the one who was there. She had 4 younger siblings, 2 brothers, 2 sisters. Owen was 16, Lily was 14, Sam was 12, and the youngest, Grace, had just turned 9. They were all in school, which meant that from the time they left in the morning until the time they came home in the afternoon, it was Nora and her father, and the land, and the particular silence that lived between 2 people who loved each other, in the way that family members sometimes do when they have run out of the language for it. She had graduated high school 2 years early, partly because she was quick and partly because the school had allowed it. She had wanted to go to the community college in Harston, which was 40 miles away. She had filled out the application herself, had gotten one of her teachers to write a letter, had even looked into a small scholarship that covered partial tuition for students from agricultural families. She had placed the application packet on the kitchen table one evening in March, 4 months ago, and Earl had looked at it without touching it, and then looked at her, and said that she was needed here, and that was the end of that conversation. She had not raised it again. She knew better, not because her father was a violent man, or an unreasonable one in every respect. He was neither of those things. He simply had a particular way of seeing the world that did not include room for wants, that conflicted with the practical requirements of survival. And in his version of survival, Nora was a working part of the household machinery, and the idea of her leaving was the same to him as the idea of the tractor breaking down. A problem, not a possibility. Tonight Dale Hargrove was coming to supper. She had met Dale Hargrove 4 or 5 times over the course of her life, in the way that everyone in Delwood had met everyone else, at the feed store, at church, at the small county fair that happened each August and drew people from 3 surrounding towns. He was a quiet man. He did not make many jokes. He shook hands firmly and always looked the other person in the eye, which people in Delwood considered a strong mark of character. He had been married to a woman named Louise, who had died 2 years ago of a heart condition that had gone undetected until it was far too late to do anything about it. Louise Hargrove had been a gentle, soft-spoken woman who made extraordinary lemon cake and organized the church bake sales with the precision of a military commander. People had genuinely liked her. Her death had been felt through the whole town, the way deaths are felt in small places, as a reminder of something everyone already knew but preferred not to think about directly. Dale had 2 children. The older one was a boy named Perry, who was 17 and already working the ranch full-time alongside the hired hands. The younger one was a girl named Clara, which Nora noticed with a jolt of strange feeling when she first heard it, because that was also her mother's name. And she was 15, and reportedly very like her mother in temperament, which people always said as though it were a comfort, and Nora supposed it was. She washed the breakfast bowls and set them to dry, and thought about supper. She thought about what her father had said. Steady. Got more land than anyone in this county besides the Perrys. Takes care of what's his. She thought about the order of those statements. Land first, then the taking care of. She noticed that her father had not said anything about whether Dale Hargrove was kind, or whether he was interesting to talk to, or whether he laughed at things, or whether he had any opinions about the world outside of Delwood that might make him a worthwhile companion for 50 or 60 years. She did not say any of this to her father. She dried the bowls and put them away. She went out to feed the chickens, because that was next on the list of things that needed doing, and the chickens did not care about Dale Hargrove, or her father's plans, or the application to Harston Community College that was still sitting somewhere in the kitchen drawer, where her father had eventually moved it without comment. The chickens were the most straightforward relationships in Nora's life. They wanted grain and water and a clean place to sleep, and in return they provided eggs, and this was an arrangement that everyone understood and no one disputed. She stood in the chicken yard with the morning sun on the back of her neck and thought about the word tonight. Tonight Dale Hargrove was coming for supper, and she knew, the way she knew most things in her life before they were told to her directly, through a slow accumulation of details and a particular kind of tension in the air, that tonight was not a casual visit. Tonight was something being decided. She went back inside and started the bread, because there was always bread to make. By noon, she had cleaned the main rooms, pressed a tablecloth, and started a stew that would take most of the afternoon. Owen came home from school at 3 and immediately went out to help their father with the fence, because the west section had been down since Tuesday and the cattle kept drifting. Lily came in and sat at the table and did her homework without being asked, which was one of the things Nora loved most about Lily. She was self-contained in a way that suggested she would be fine, no matter what the world asked of her. Sam came in, loud and hungry as always, ate an apple, and was sent back outside. Grace came in last, trailing a piece of ribbon she had found somewhere, and sat in the corner of the kitchen, talking to herself in the way that 9-year-olds talk to themselves when they are working out a story that exists only inside their own heads. Nora watched her little sister, and felt something that she could not name precisely. It was not jealousy exactly. It was something closer to a wish that Grace would have time, that the story inside her head would get the years it needed to become something real before anyone tried to rewrite it for her. She set the table with the good dishes, which they almost never used. Dale Hargrove arrived at 6 o'clock exactly. He knocked twice, which Earl had clearly told him to do, because Earl did not knock and had no opinion about whether other people should. Dale came in holding his hat in both hands, which was a thing men in that part of the country did when they were being respectful, and he said good evening to Nora and looked at her in a way that she could not entirely read. Not unkind at all, but assessing, the way a person looks at something when they are trying to decide if it will last. They sat at the table. Earl served himself first, as he always did. Dale waited until Nora had taken her seat. That was the first thing she noticed about him. The conversation over supper was mostly between Earl and Dale. They talked about the price of hay, which had gone up, and the price of beef, which had not gone up enough to compensate for the hay, and the condition of the road on the south end of the county, which had been in need of repair for 2 years and showed no sign of being attended to. They talked about the weather, about rain that had not come when it should have, and would come too much later in the season, when the timing was wrong for it to do any good. Nora listened. She answered when she was spoken to directly. She refilled the water glasses and made sure the bread basket was not empty. She felt, across the table, Dale Hargrove glancing at her occasionally, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that was quiet and steady and suggested he was paying attention, even while talking about hay prices. Grace spilled her water, and there was a small commotion, and Dale helped mop it up without being asked, without making a face, without any of the slight but unmistakable irritation that Earl would have shown. That was the second thing Nora noticed. After supper, Earl sent the younger children to bed early and told Owen to check on the cattle. Then it was just the 3 of them at the table, and the kitchen was very quiet, and the light from the single bulb overhead cast long shadows down the length of the room. Dale set down his coffee cup. He looked at Nora. Then he looked at Earl. Then he looked back at Nora. "I expect your father has mentioned that I've been thinking on some things," he said. His voice was even and unhurried, the voice of a man who had practiced patience the way other men practice a trade. Nora looked at him. "He mentioned you might be stopping by," she said. Dale nodded slowly. "I'm going to be straight with you," he said, "because I don't see any good reason not to be. I have a ranch that needs running. I have 2 children who need steadiness. I'm at a point in my life where I understand what I'm looking for. And I believe your father and I are of a similar mind about what would be good for both our families." He paused. "I'm not a young man. I know that. But I'm a serious one. And I would treat you right." The room was very quiet. Nora looked at the table. She looked at her father, whose expression was that of a man who had already made up his mind, and was simply waiting for the formality of the conversation to reach its natural conclusion. She looked at Dale Hargrove, who was watching her with those steady eyes that held nothing threatening, but also held nothing she recognized as seeing her specifically. Not the 18-year-old daughter of Earl Calloway, not the practical and capable girl who had been keeping this household together since she was 11, but her, Nora, whatever that was. She thought about her mother. She thought about the college application in the kitchen drawer. She thought about the bread she had made that afternoon, and the way the dough had felt under her hands, alive and patient, and waiting to become what it was going to become. She did not say yes, and she did not say no. She said, "When are you thinking this would happen?" Earl said, 6 weeks. Nora looked at her father for a long moment. Then she picked up her coffee cup and finished what was in it. "All right," she said. And those 2 words, quiet as they were, felt like the sound of a door closing on something she had not yet had the chance to open. Dale Hargrove went home at 8:30. Earl washed his own cup, which he rarely did, and went to bed without saying anything further. Nora sat at the kitchen table alone for a while, with the lamp on. She did not cry. She was not the kind of person who cried easily. Or at least, she had not been, for a very long time. She sat and looked at the grain in the wood of the table, which she had looked at 10,000 times before, and she thought about the word right. "I would treat you right." She turned it over in her mind the way you turn over a stone to see what is underneath it. Right. It was a careful word. An honest word, maybe. But it was not the word she would have chosen, if anyone had thought to ask her what word she was looking for. No one had thought to ask. Outside, the land was dark and flat, and the stars over Delwood were very bright, the way stars only get when there are no other lights to compete with them. And somewhere out in the pasture, a cow called once, and then went quiet, and Nora Calloway sat at her kitchen table and understood. With the clear, sober certainty that sometimes visits people at the exact moment when it will do the least good, that her life was about to change in a direction she had not chosen, and that she was going to let it, because she did not yet know what it would cost her not to. She got up. She turned off the lamp. She went to bed. In the morning there was more to do, as there always was, and she did it. The wedding date moved through Nora's days the way a stone moves through shallow water, steadily, with no pause, grinding against everything underneath it. 6 weeks, her father had said. 6 weeks felt like an amount of time that was both too long and not long enough. Too long to hold the knowledge without it wearing something away inside her. Not long enough to figure out what, if anything, she could do about it. She had not told anyone. Not Lily, who was the person she was closest to in the family, and not her friend Ruth, who lived 2 miles down the road and had been the person Nora sat next to at school for 7 years, and who now worked at the gas station and beauty parlor hybrid that served as the center of most social life in Delwood. She had not said a word, and the not saying had its own particular weight, the way unexpressed things always do. They do not disappear. They simply relocate, somewhere inside you where they are harder to reach but heavier to carry. The days in between were ordinary in the way that days are when something large is coming. You do the same things. You make the same breakfast. You tend the same animals. You watch the same light move across the same walls. But underneath the ordinary, there is a current of something that makes even familiar things feel slightly strange. The coffee tastes a little different. The flour feels different between your fingers. The sound of your own voice answering a simple question has an echo you never noticed before. On the 4th day after the supper, Earl told the younger children. He told them at the breakfast table, directly, the way he told them everything, as fact, not as something to be discussed. He said that Nora was going to marry Dale Hargrove, and that it was a good arrangement for the family, and that he expected everyone to behave properly and not carry on about it. Lily did not carry on. She went very still, which was Lily's version of carrying on. She looked at Nora from across the table, with a look that asked several questions at once, and then looked back down at her plate, and said nothing. Sam said that Dale Hargrove had a really big tractor, which he meant as a compliment to the arrangement. Owen said nothing at all, and left the table early, and went out to the barn. Grace started crying almost immediately, though she was too young to fully understand what she was crying about, and Nora pulled her onto her lap and held her, and said that everything was fine, which was the kind of lie that people tell young children, not because children believe them, but because saying them holds the world still for just a moment. That evening, Lily found Nora at the chicken yard and stood beside her, while the chickens moved around their feet in their stupid and contented way, and Lily said, "Is this what you want?" It was such a direct question, said with such quiet plainness, that Nora was momentarily unable to answer it. She had been expecting something softer. "Are you all right, or do you think it will be okay?" The kinds of questions that already contain their answers, and do not require you to go anywhere near the truth. It's a good arrangement for the family, Nora said, because she had heard those words, and they were the only ones she had. Lily looked at her. Lily was 14, and had their mother's face, the high, sharp cheekbones, the brown eyes that always looked like they were reading something 2 feet past whatever was in front of them. She looked at Nora the way their mother used to look at things when she did not believe them, but understood that pressing further would not help. "That's not what I asked," Lily said. Nora opened the gate and shooed a chicken back into the yard. "Go do your homework," she said, not unkindly. Lily went. She looked back once, but she went. On the 6th day, Nora drove herself to the Hargrove Ranch. Her father had told her she should go over and spend some time there, learn the layout of the house and the kitchen, meet the children properly. He said it as though it were a practical errand, like going to the feed store, and in his mind it probably was. Nora borrowed the truck and drove the 4 miles between their property and Dale's without the radio on, which was her way of thinking. She needed quiet around her when she was trying to sort through something, and she was always trying to sort through something now. The Hargrove Ranch was a different scale from what she had grown up with. There were just over 800 acres, and the house itself was solid and generous in a way that their house was not. 2 stories, with a wide porch that ran across the front and wrapped around the side, and a bunkhouse behind the main structure where 3 hired hands lived, and a barn that was twice the size of their barn and in much better repair. It was not a showplace. It was a working ranch that had been maintained by someone who understood the value of maintenance, and there was something in that which Nora, who had grown up watching things slowly fall into disrepair from a lack of money and a lack of extra hours, noticed and could not entirely help appreciating. She parked the truck and walked to the front door and knocked. Perry Hargrove opened it. He was 17, with his father's build starting to show in his shoulders, and a face that was still boyish, but moving steadily out of it. He looked at Nora with the particular wariness of a young person who has recently been told that the shape of his household is about to change and is not sure how he feels about it. He did not say anything for a second. "My dad said you were coming," he finally said. "He told me to come," Nora said, which was accurate, and which made Perry's expression shift slightly, as though this admission of circumstance made her a little more understandable to him. He stepped back and let her in. The house smelled like wood and coffee, and something faintly herbal, that she later learned was the dried sage that Dale's late wife had kept in a bundle near the back door, and that no one had moved since she died. The kitchen was large and serviceable, and it had a few things that Nora and her father's house did not have, including a dishwasher that sounded like it worked, and a propane range with 6 burners. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment and looked at it with the eye of someone who had spent a great deal of time in kitchens and understood them as spaces that either cooperate with you or fight you, and this one looked like it would cooperate. Clara Hargrove came downstairs. She was 15, and where Perry was guarded, Clara was watchful in a different way, more open, more curious, with the direct gaze of a person who has decided that the most efficient approach to uncertainty is simply to look at it plainly. She had dark hair and very light eyes, which was an unusual combination, and she was carrying a book under her arm, the way people carry books when they read constantly, and have simply stopped noticing they are doing it. "You're Nora," she said. "I am." "Do you like horses?" It was such an unexpected question that Nora blinked. "I've always been all right with horses," she said. "We only keep cattle, so I haven't spent as much time with them as I might have otherwise." Clara considered this. "We have 4. I'll show you later if you want. Perry doesn't let anyone near Badger, but if you don't go near Badger, you'll be fine. He bites." "The horse or Perry?" Clara looked at her for a moment, and then made a sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh, quickly controlled. "The horse," she said. "Perry just sulks." From somewhere in the back of the house, Perry's voice said, "I can hear you." Clara said, "I know," and looked back at Nora. "Come in then. I'll put the kettle on." This was how Nora's first real visit to the Hargrove house went. Clara making tea, and Perry hanging around the edges of the kitchen, without committing to either leaving or sitting down, and Nora, standing at the counter, looking at the kitchen, and trying to imagine herself in it, every day. Trying to see herself opening those cupboard doors and knowing what was behind them. Trying to feel at home somewhere that belonged entirely to someone else, and to the shape of a life she had not lived. Dale himself was out in the fields and did not come in until she had been there nearly 2 hours. When he came through the back door, he was dusty and tired in the way of a man who has been working all day, and he washed his hands at the sink and dried them, and turned to look at her with a kind of relieved surprise, as though he had half expected she would not actually come. "How are you finding it?" he asked. "It's a good property," she said. He nodded. He sat down at the table. Clara immediately put a cup of coffee in front of him, and this small automatic gesture, the ease of it, the way it belonged to a long-established pattern, made Nora feel the strangeness of her position more acutely than anything else had so far. There were rhythms in this house that had nothing to do with her. There were habits and routines and small arrangements made between these three people by time and necessity and the shared experience of loss, and she was being asked to step into them from the outside, and the truth was that she did not know how that was done. Dale looked at her across the table. Perry had finally sat down and was eating an apple. Clara was reading her book. "They're not easy," Dale said, tipping his head toward his children in a way that managed to be affectionate and honest at the same time. "Perry especially. He's been the man of this house in his own mind since his mother died, and he doesn't want to give that up, but he's a good boy. He'll come around." "I'm right here," Perry said. "I know you are," Dale said. Nora looked at the three of them. She looked at the kitchen with its 6-burner range, and its window that faced east toward the fields. She looked at the dried sage bundle near the back door, that no one had moved in 2 years. She thought about Louise Hargrove, who had made extraordinary lemon cake and organized bake sales with military precision, and who had sat in this kitchen, drinking coffee with her husband every morning, until she could not anymore. She thought about stepping into the outline of someone else's life, and whether that was something a person could do without losing the outline of their own. "I'll be honest with you too," she said to Dale. "I haven't agreed to this because I'm certain it's what I want. I've agreed because my father arranged it, and I don't have a better option in front of me right now. I'm telling you that because I don't think starting something with a lie, even a quiet one, does anyone any good." The kitchen was very still. Perry had stopped eating his apple. Clara's book was down. Dale looked at her for a long, measured moment. "I appreciate that," he said finally. "I'd rather know where I stand." "Now you do," Nora said. She drove home in the late afternoon, with the sun angling through the truck window, and thought about what she had just said, and was not entirely sure where it had come from. She was not usually someone who said difficult things out loud. She was more in the habit of carrying them. But something about the Hargrove kitchen, about Clara asking if she liked horses, about the dried sage bundle by the door, something about all of it had made her feel that if she was going to do this thing, she was going to do it with at least one clear statement on the table. She did not feel better for having said it, but she felt more like herself, which was not the same thing, and was also, she was beginning to understand, considerably more important. The weeks moved forward. There was a great deal of practical arrangement. Earl met with Dale twice more, and there were conversations about the future of both properties that Nora was not invited to, and did not ask to join, because she understood that those conversations were about land, and she was, in those conversations, a detail, a person whose presence was necessary to the arrangement, but whose perspective on the arrangement was not the thing being arranged. This was not bitterness. It was simply the way she saw it. She had grown up watching her father make decisions, and she understood his logic, even when she did not share it. Ruth, at the beauty parlor and gas station, found out through the particular channels by which news moves in small towns. A comment made in passing, overheard and transmitted, and slightly altered at each stage of its journey, until it arrived at its destination, wearing a shape that was related to but not identical to the original. Ruth found Nora at the end of the week in the small parking area behind the church where they had met up since they were children, and Ruth said, very directly, because Ruth was direct in the way that people are when they have never had to learn to be otherwise, "Is it true about you and Dale Hargrove?" "Yes," Nora said. Ruth looked at her the way Lily had looked at her, but with less restraint. "Nora, he's almost 45. 44, Nora said. That's a lot." "It is." Ruth seemed to be searching for what to say next. She settled on, "Do you love him?" "I don't know him," Nora said. "You can't love someone you don't know." "People try to," Ruth said. "People try to a lot of things," Nora said. That doesn't make them work. Ruth put her arm through Nora's in the way they had walked together since they were small, and they stood there in the church parking area in the early evening, while the light went gold and pink over the rooftops. And Ruth did not say anything else, and neither did Nora. And in that silence was everything that both of them knew about being young and female, and living in Delwood, which was a great deal more than either of them had ever said out loud about it. The following Sunday, Nora went to church with her family as usual, and Dale Hargrove's family was there as usual, and they sat in their regular pews on the same side of the building with 2 rows between them, and the preacher spoke about patience and about trust in the unseen workings of a larger plan. Nora listened to the sermon and looked at her hands in her lap and tried to find something in those words that she could use. Trust in the unseen. She had been trusting in the unseen her entire life by necessity, because the seen things had not always gone in her favor, and she was not sure the unseen ones had done much better, but at least they had not announced their intentions in advance, which had a certain mercy to it. After the service, there was the small courtyard gathering, where people drank weak coffee and talked about nothing of substance, in the particular polite way of people who see each other every week, and have long since run out of things to say, but continue saying them. Nora stood with her father, and Dale Hargrove stood beside her father, and people came up and said things that were congratulatory, in a way that assumed her agreement, and she smiled and said thank you, and felt, for the first time, the full weight of what it meant to be inside a fact. She was not someone to whom this was happening. She was someone this was happening to, which is a different thing entirely. And for the first time she let herself feel the exact size of that difference, standing in a church courtyard in Delwood on a Sunday morning, smiling at people who were congratulating her on a decision she had not made. That night she lay in the bed she had slept in since she was a child and looked at the ceiling and thought about what she wanted. Not what was practical, not what was good for the family, not what her father needed, or what Dale Hargrove needed, or what the ordinary weight of circumstance in a small town in dry country required of an 18-year-old girl with no money and nowhere clear to go. What did she want? She turned the question over for a long time. It was harder than she expected, because she had spent so long not asking it that she had almost forgotten how. It was like a muscle that had not been used. It was there, but it was stiff, and it resisted her. The thing she found, when she got past all the layers of what was practical and what was expected, was very simple. It was not glamorous, and it was not dramatic. It was just a room of her own choosing, with a window she had picked because she liked the light that came through it, and a morning that belonged to her rather than to anyone else's needs, and the small, daily experience of being asked what she thought about something, not told, not arranged around, but asked, and of that answer mattering to whoever had asked it. That was what she found at the bottom of the question. She was going to marry Dale Hargrove in 5 weeks. She turned over and closed her eyes, and she did not sleep for a very long time, and when she did finally sleep, she did not dream, and in the morning she got up and made breakfast for her family, and the land outside the window was the same as it had always been, and the sky was clear, and the day moved forward the way days always do, without asking anyone's permission. There were men in Delwood who had spent their whole lives being described as decent, and Dale Hargrove was one of them. Decent was the word the town used for him, the way you use a piece of furniture, reliably, without thinking very hard about it, because it was simply always there, and had always served its purpose. Decent meant he paid his debts on time. It meant he did not raise his voice in public. It meant he showed up when someone needed help moving something heavy, or when a neighbor's fence went down in a storm. It meant he gave fair wages to the men who worked for him, and did not keep them waiting on payday. In Delwood, decent was a high compliment. It was the kind of word that built a man's reputation slowly, the way sediment builds, until he was standing on top of a 30-year accumulation of small, reliable acts, and the whole town looked up at him and saw something solid. Nora thought about decent a great deal during those weeks. She thought about what it meant and what it did not mean. It did not mean warm. It did not mean tender. It did not mean the particular quality of attention that makes another person feel as though the room has shifted slightly when they enter it. Decent was a word about behavior, about the external surface of a life, and it told you very little about what existed underneath that surface. She was not naive enough to expect anything dramatic. She had never been a girl who believed in fairy tale transformations. But she was also, and this was something she had only recently started to admit to herself. Someone who wanted more than the word decent could contain. She went to the Hargrove Ranch 4 more times before the wedding. Each visit had a purpose assigned to it by her father, or by practical necessity. To see the kitchen properly, to understand the household routine, to meet the hands who worked the property, and know their names. She approached each visit the way she approached most things. Practically, without complaint, paying close attention. The hands were 3 in number. There was a man named Gus, who was around 50, and had been on the Hargrove property for 12 years, and knew every acre of it better than he knew his own reflection. There was a man named Frank, who was quiet and kept to himself, and was apparently extraordinary with the cattle, in a way that went beyond technique, into something closer to intuition. And there was Cade Renfro. She met Cade on her second visit, at the end of a morning, when she had been going through the kitchen with Dale and Clara, and learning which cabinet held what, and which burner ran a little hot. She had stepped out the back door to get some air, and found him at the water trough beside the barn, filling a bucket, not looking up. He was younger than the other 2 hands, by a significant distance. He was 24, she would later learn, which made him 6 years older than her. He was lean and sun-darkened in the way of someone who works outside in all seasons, and he wore his hat low so that the first thing she saw of his face was the line of his jaw and the way he moved. Unhurried and precisely, without a wasted motion, the way people move when they have learned their body through work rather than through vanity. He looked up when she stepped out. He did not startle, he simply looked, and she had the immediate and unsettling feeling that this was someone who noticed things, who had been noticing things for some time, and had gotten very good at it. "You must be Nora," he said. "Most people are told before they're asked," she said. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, something adjacent to it. "Perry mentioned you were coming," he said. He set the bucket down and straightened. "I'm Cade." She knew that already, because Gus had mentioned the names of the 3 hands when she arrived. She said, "How long have you been working here?" "Going on 3 years," he said. "Came up from Crane County." She nodded. She looked at the barn, which was large and well-maintained, the wood darkened by years of weather, but solid. "Why Delwood?" she said. It was an idle question, the kind of question you ask when you are standing beside someone you have just met, and the silence would otherwise be complete. He looked at the barn too for a moment. "Needed a fresh start," he said. "Delwood seemed far enough from where I'd been, without being so far, that I couldn't find my way back if I needed to." She thought that was an interesting way to choose a place to live. She had never had the option of choosing, which perhaps was why she found it interesting. She went back inside, and spent the rest of the morning learning where Dale kept the spare propane tanks, and how the water pressure worked in the upstairs bathroom, and which window in the bedroom at the back of the house needed to be propped open, because the latch was broken. These were the practical facts of the life she was stepping into, and she filed them away the way she filed everything, carefully, without drama, because drama required energy she did not have to spare. She thought about Cade Renfro, only briefly that evening, and what she thought was simply that he seemed like a person who had chosen to be where he was, which was more than she could say for herself. Then she set that thought aside, and went to sleep. The town of Delwood, meanwhile, was doing what small towns do when something happens. It was talking. The engagement of Earl Calloway's eldest daughter to Dale Hargrove had moved through the social structures of the community, with the speed and enthusiasm of information that people feel entitled to have opinions about. At the feed store, at the beauty parlor, at the church, in the parking lot after Sunday service, in the particular kind of telephone conversation that begins with, "I probably shouldn't say anything but," people were saying things. Most of what they said was positive, or at least positive in its surface presentation. It was a good match. Dale was a solid man, and he needed a woman in that house. The Calloway girl was sensible and capable. It would be good for both families. The land situation, and here voices lowered slightly, because land was a topic that required a certain discretion in Delwood, where everyone knew what everyone else had, and what they had lost. The land situation made a great deal of sense. Earl Calloway was not in a position to provide for his family indefinitely, the way things were going, and this would give the younger children a better chance. But underneath the positive surface of these comments, there were other things being said, in a lower register that was not quite spoken, and not quite thought, but existed somewhere in between. "She's only 18, he's been a widower for 2 years, and those children need a mother," Earl Calloway's never been easy, has he? The girl never seemed like someone who would settle for Delwood. Did she have any say in it? Well, it's not our place to ask. Ruth heard all of it. She told Nora some of it in the frank and unfiltered way that only very old friends can. And Nora listened without expression, and said that she appreciated Ruth telling her, and that none of it changed anything. Does anything change anything for you right now? Ruth asked, with a frustration in her voice that was actually a kind of love. The frustration of someone who can see the shape of a problem very clearly, but cannot reach inside it. Not much, Nora said. I don't have the means for it. Ruth looked out the window of the beauty parlor at the gas pumps and the gravel lot. You could leave, she said. You could go to Harston. You could get a job there, take classes. Nora looked at her. With what money? She said. And who looks after the little ones? Ruth did not have an answer to that. There was no good answer to that. This was the particular trap that Nora was in, and they both knew it. The trap that looks from the outside like a choice between two options, but is actually not a choice at all, because one of the options requires resources that are simply not present. You could leave, yes, and you could also stay and watch your family struggle, and know that you had the practical means to have prevented it, and chose not to. These were the real terms of Nora's situation, and they were not dramatic or unusual. They were the ordinary terms of a great many lives in a great many places, and the fact that they were ordinary did not make them easier. On Nora's third visit to the Hargrove Ranch, she spent an afternoon with Clara. This had not been planned. She had come to discuss something with Dale about the practical arrangements, and Dale had been called out to the East Field because one of the water troughs had a problem. And Clara had looked at Nora standing in the kitchen, with nowhere particular to go, and said, "Come to the barn. I'll show you the horses." Nora went. The 4 horses were named Badger, Minnow, Sunday, and a very old and gentle gray mare named Pearl, who stood by the fence when Clara approached and put her nose directly into Clara's hands without being asked, as though this was a greeting that had been happening every day for years, which it had. "She was my mother's horse," Clara said. "My dad keeps saying she's too old to ride anymore, but she's not really. She just goes slower than she used to." Nora stroked Pearl's nose. The horse was warm and solid, and looked at her with the particular expression of old animals, which is one of patient waiting rather than urgency. She thought about this horse belonging to Louise Hargrove, and about Louise Hargrove, and about what it meant to inherit someone else's life. "What was she like?" Nora asked. "Your mother." Clara was quiet for a moment. She was scratching Sunday behind the ear, in a way the horse clearly enjoyed, and she did not look at Nora when she answered. "She was very organized," she said. "She always knew where everything was. She never raised her voice, not once, that I can remember. She made everything seem manageable, even when it wasn't." She paused. She was also funny. People don't always know that about her. They think of her as the church bake sale woman. But she was actually really funny when it was just us. She'd say things, just quiet things, under her breath, that made my dad laugh so hard he'd have to set his coffee down. Nora listened to this. She thought about making someone laugh like that, about being known well enough by another person that a quiet word could reach them that way. She thought about how long it took to build that kind of knowing with someone, and about how 6 weeks was not that amount of time. "She sounds like someone I'd have liked," Nora said. Clara looked at her then. She had the quality, this 15-year-old girl, of a person who was very careful about deciding things, but once decided was committed. She looked at Nora for a moment, and then she said, "Perry thinks you're only doing this because our dad has money and land."
"Your dad's land is not money," Nora said. "It's land. Those are different things."
"Perry doesn't think so." "Perry might be right," Nora said. "In a way. Your father has stability that my family doesn't. That's part of why I'm here. I'm not going to pretend it isn't." Clara considered this. "Is it the only reason?" Nora thought about it. "No," she said. "Your father is a serious man. He's honest and he's careful, and he doesn't make me uncomfortable. Those things matter. But you don't love him." "I don't know him," Nora said, for the second time to a second member of his family. "You can't love someone you don't know." Clara was quiet for a moment, then she said, "He cried. After my mom died, not in front of us. He'd think that was wrong, showing that. But I heard him once. In the barn, alone. It went on for a while." She paused. I just wanted you to know that. That he feels things. He's not just stable. He feels things. Nora looked at this 15-year-old girl who was trying, with everything she had, to make her father seem lovable, in advance of a marriage that she had not asked for, any more than Nora had. She thought about what it cost Clara to say that, to offer up her father's grief like something to recommend him. I'll remember that, she said. On the fourth visit, she arrived to find Cade Renfro replacing a hinge on the barn door. It was a two-person job, and she was the only other person around, so she held the door at the right angle while he worked, which took about 15 minutes. They did not talk much. He worked with a focused economy that did not require conversation, and she held the door steady and watched his hands, which were quick and certain and did not fumble. When it was done, he stepped back and tested the swing of the door. It moved perfectly, easy and even. He said, "Thank you," and she said, "Sure," and started to walk back toward the house. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She stopped, turned back. He was looking at her in that direct, careful way. The sun was behind her, which meant she could see his face clearly, and she suspected he could not fully see hers, and she found she was glad of this small advantage. "How are you doing?" he said, with all of it. It was not what she had expected. Not many people had asked her this, and the ones who had asked it with their own agendas attached. Her father checking whether she would be cooperative, Ruth expressing her worry, Clara looking for evidence that this would be all right. Cade asked it the way you ask something when you genuinely do not know the answer and want to. She thought about what to say. She settled on the truth, which she was doing more of lately, as though the proximity of a future she did not choose was burning away her patience for anything else. "I'm doing the way you do, when something is happening around you, and you haven't figured out yet whether you have any power over it," she said. He nodded slowly, like that was an answer that made sense to him, like he had been in that exact place before, and recognized it from the inside. "You do," he said, "have power over it, more than you think." She did not know what to do with that. She turned and walked back to the house, and did not think about it for the rest of the afternoon, and then thought about it for a very long time that night. Dale Hargrove drove out to see her father twice more in those weeks, and on one of those visits, she sat with them for part of the conversation. They discussed the future of the Calloway property, whether Earl might take on some grazing rights for Dale's cattle in exchange for certain financial considerations. They discussed the wedding, which would be at the church in Delwood on a Saturday morning in 4 weeks. They discussed practical things, what Nora would bring with her, what would remain. At one point, Earl said something about what Nora could be expected to contribute to the running of the Hargrove household, listing her abilities with the matter-of-fact brevity of a man describing the specifications of useful equipment. Nora sat across the table from her father and her future husband, and felt herself being discussed around, and she thought about Cade Renfro testing the barn door and saying thank you, and about Clara at the horse fence saying he feels things, and about Lily in the chicken yard asking, "Is this what you want?" and about all the people who had asked her versions of that question, versus all the people who had simply proceeded on the assumption that the question did not need to be asked. She counted them. The people who had asked. Lily, Ruth, Clara, Cade. 4 people, 3 of whom were young, and 1 of whom had worked on this man's ranch for 3 years. The people who had not asked. Her father, who had arranged this. Dale himself, who had presented it to her, as a reasonable conclusion. Every person at church who had congratulated her. The entire structural weight of a community that had decided, long before she was born, what the shape of a life like hers was supposed to look like. She looked at Dale across the table. He was looking at her father, and talking about hay prices. He was a good man. She was increasingly certain of that. He was a serious, careful, decent man, who had cried alone in his barn after his wife died, and who let his daughter read books at the table, and who had, when she told him plainly that she was not certain she was making this choice freely, said that he appreciated knowing where he stood. None of that was nothing. She knew it was not nothing. But she also knew, sitting at that table, that the person she was becoming in those weeks, the person who held barn doors and said true things, and thought about power and choice and the small space between them, that person was not the same person who had stirred oatmeal on the morning her father said Dale Hargrove was coming to supper. She was changing, and the change was not coming from the future that was being arranged for her. It was coming from the part of her that was refusing, quietly and without announcement, to be only that. Outside, the land went on as it always had, flat and honest about what it was. In Delwood, Dale Hargrove was described as decent, and this was considered sufficient. Nora Calloway sat at the table where the rest of her life was being decided, and did not speak, and was not asked to, and held everything she was feeling with both hands, the way you hold something that has no container yet, waiting for the shape of it to become clear. There is a particular kind of man who watches and says almost nothing, and the world tends to underestimate him right up until the moment he does the one thing that reveals how much he has seen. He had been that kind of man since he was a boy in Crane County, growing up in a house where the adult conversations happened at a level of volume and frequency that meant a quiet child either disappeared entirely or learned to listen very well. Cade had chosen listening. He had come to Delwood 3 years ago, under the plain and understated circumstances he had described to Nora. He needed a fresh start, and Delwood was far enough from where he had been. This was true as far as it went, which was not very far. The longer version involved a family situation in Crane County that he did not talk about to anyone, a period of about 8 months, in which he had made several decisions he was not proud of, and had spent considerable time afterwards sitting with the weight of them, and then a slow and deliberate process of moving himself towards something better, which for him looked like a job on a decent ranch, work that required his body and his attention, rather than the complicated interior operations he had been stuck inside for too long. Dale Hargrove had hired him on a Tuesday afternoon and asked no questions about where he'd come from, which was exactly what Cade needed, and more than he expected. Dale was not an indifferent employer. He noticed things about his hands, whether they were struggling, whether they were sick, whether they were eating. But he was a man who respected the private life of another person and did not probe where he had not been invited, and this was a quality Cade recognized and was deeply grateful for, even if he never said so. He had spent 3 years learning the Hargrove land the way he learned everything, thoroughly, from the ground up. He knew which pastures ran wet in spring and had to be managed carefully. He knew the water table on the east quarter and the way the wind moved across the south field in summer, and how to read the cattle's behavior when something in the herd dynamics was shifting, before it became a visible problem. He was good at this work in the way that some people are good at something, because it fits the shape of how their mind works. Practical, patient, attentive to systems and patterns, and the slow language of land and animals. He had also been, for 3 years, aware of the broader landscape of Delwood, in the way that people from outside a place are sometimes more aware of it than the people who grew up inside it. He did not share the assumptions that people who had always lived there carried about each other, the invisible categories of who was solid and who was flighty, who was respectable and who was difficult, what the normal shape of a life looked like, and what it meant to deviate from it. He watched the town with the eye of someone who had not been told in advance what to see. He had seen Nora Calloway. Not often, and not in any way he could have explained satisfactorily to another person without it sounding like something it was not. He had seen her at church, at the feed store, once on the road where their vehicles passed going opposite directions, and she lifted 2 fingers off the steering wheel in the small wave that people give each other on country roads. He had registered her in the way you register someone who has a particular quality of attention about them, a quality of being fully present in what they are doing, without the performance of it, without looking around to see who is watching. She carried water. She talked to the chickens. She spoke to the feed store man with the easy efficiency of someone who has been doing the family accounts for a long time and knows exactly what she needs and what it costs. He had not thought about her beyond that, or not beyond it in any way that required him to do anything about it, because there was nothing to do, and nothing had required doing. She was Earl Calloway's daughter, and she was 18 years old, and she lived her life on the other side of a 4-mile road from the Hargrove Ranch, and those were simply the facts. And Cade was a person who had learned, at considerable personal cost, to pay attention to facts. Then, the announcement came. He heard it first from Gus, who had heard it from someone at the feed store, who had heard it from someone who had been at the church parking lot. Gus mentioned it with the particular tone of someone passing along information they expect to be of only moderate interest. Earl Calloway's fixing to marry off that eldest girl to the boss, he said, and went back to mending the fence he was working on. Cade did not say anything. He went back to what he was doing too, which was checking the water line on the south side of the property. He walked the line and checked each connection, and took notes on his small pad, and did all the things that needed doing. And while he did them, something was moving in him that he did not immediately have a name for. It was not his business. He was clear about that from the start. Dale was his employer, and a man he respected, and he had no standing to have any opinion about Dale's personal arrangements. And even if he had, opinions about other people's decisions are the cheapest thing in the world, and worth exactly what they cost. So he told himself it was not his business, and he went back to the bunkhouse that evening and ate dinner with Gus and Frank, and said even less than usual, which Gus noticed and mentioned, and which Cade deflected by asking about the cattle report. He saw her the next week when she came for her first visit. He was by the water trough, the bucket in his hand, and she came out the back door, and their eyes met in the particular direct way of people who are not performing anything and do not waste time on preamble. She had said, "Most people are told before they're asked." He had thought, in the moment, this is someone who says what she thinks. This is someone who thinks more than she says, and what she does say is worth hearing. He had said, "How long have you been working here?" And she had corrected him. She had said she came to learn the kitchen, not to work. This person, he thought, does not miss a detail. After she went back inside, he stood by the barn for a minute and watched the door close behind her, and thought about what it must be like to have the rest of your life arranged around you, without much in the way of being consulted about it. He had been inside arrangements himself, though they looked different from the outside. He had been inside the kind of arrangement where circumstances close around you like walls, because you made choices that had consequences, and the consequences had their own logic that did not pause to ask what you preferred. He had gotten out of that by a combination of stubbornness and luck, and he knew it. He thought about whether she would get out of anything. He dismissed the thought. It was not his business. Over the following weeks, with each of her visits to the ranch, he found himself aware of her in a way that was different from the awareness he had had of her before. Before, she had been a person in his peripheral vision. Now, she was someone he had spoken to, someone whose voice and manner he could recall with some precision, and this made her more present somehow, more particular. He noticed when she arrived. He noticed the particular focus she brought to the things she was learning about the property, the way she asked practical questions that cut straight to what she needed to know, without wasting the other person's time. He noticed that she was kinder to Clara than was strictly required by politeness, and that Perry's wariness did not seem to make her defensive. She simply waited it out with a patience that suggested she had dealt with more difficult people than a sulky 17-year-old boy. He noticed that she never once looked at Dale Hargrove the way a person looks at someone they are in love with. She looked at Dale the way she looked at the propane range, with a competent assessment of what it would require of her, and what she could expect in return. He told himself that this was not his observation to make. On the day he was fixing the barn door hinge, he had not planned to say anything to her. She had simply been there, which was convenient for the hinge job, and they had worked together without needing to discuss it, and he had been grateful for the efficiency of it, and the fact that she could read what the task required without being told. When it was done and she started to walk away, he found himself saying, "Can I ask you something?" He had not decided to say it. It said itself. She stopped and turned, and he asked how she was doing with all of it, and she said the thing about not knowing yet whether she had any power over the situation. It was such an exact description of a thing that he recognized from the inside that he was momentarily not entirely sure how to respond to it. He said what he said, "You do have power over it, more than you think," and he was not sure if that was true, or if it was something he said because he wanted it to be true for her, because the alternative was too much like something he already knew too well. She walked back to the house without another word, and he went back to the barn, and that evening, he sat on the bunkhouse steps while Gus played cards with Frank inside, and the night came down over the Hargrove land, and he thought about the particular quality of self-possession that Nora Calloway had, even inside circumstances that were not her choosing. He thought about how people get that quality, and his conclusion was that you do not get it from things going well. You get it from things going badly, and from deciding, somewhere in the middle of the badly going, that you are going to remain yourself regardless. She had been deciding that for some time, he thought, probably since she was much younger than 18. The wedding was 3 weeks away, when he overheard the conversation between Earl and Dale. He was not trying to overhear it. He had come up to the back door of the house to return a piece of equipment he had borrowed from the kitchen tool drawer, a wrench that had no business being in a kitchen, but was there, and he had needed it for the field line. And the door was slightly open, and before he understood that he was hearing something private, he had already heard enough of it to understand what it was. Earl was talking about what Nora would contribute to the Hargrove household. He was describing her in the way Cade had heard men describe useful things, thoroughly, accurately, with a kind of pride in the specifications that came from ownership rather than from love. She can cook anything you put in front of her. She's been keeping accounts since she was 12. She doesn't carry on about things. She's steady. Dale said something in response, something that Cade could not hear clearly, something that had the cadence of agreement. Then Earl said something that Cade heard very clearly. He said, "She understands what's expected of her. She always has. That's one thing you can count on with Nora. She understands what's expected." Cade stood outside the door for a moment. He stepped back from it quietly, without knocking. He went back to the barn and put the wrench where it belonged, and stood in the middle of the barn for a long time doing nothing in particular, while around him, the horses moved in their stalls, and the afternoon light fell through the high gaps in the boards. She understands what's expected of her. He had heard that said as a compliment about a person before. He had heard it used to describe workers, and he had heard it used to describe children. And once, at a gathering in Crane County that he remembered with no fondness, he had heard it used to describe a woman by her husband. It was a compliment that contained inside it a very particular kind of sorrow. The sorrow of a person who has learned to make themselves into exactly what is required of them, so thoroughly that the people around them can no longer see the difference between that performance and the person it is covering. He did not know Nora Calloway well enough to know whether that description of her was accurate or incomplete. He knew her somewhat, the handful of conversations, the quality of her attention, the barn door afternoon, the exact and careful way she said, "I haven't agreed to this because I'm certain it's what I want." That last thing, he had heard that, from Clara, who had repeated it at supper that evening with something that sounded like admiration in her voice. That last thing was not the statement of someone who understood only what was expected of her. That was the statement of someone who was still in there, still aware of the distinction between who she was and what was being asked of her. He told himself, again, that it was not his business. He went to work the next morning the way he always went to work, and the day after that, and the day after that. He was 3 weeks older, and the wedding was 3 weeks closer, and he told himself with the particular regularity of someone who is not convinced by their own argument that Nora Calloway's life was her own, and the lives of the people around her were their own, and the arrangements between them were their arrangements, and he had no standing to interfere, and no reason to, and the world was full of situations that a person could not help and had to simply let be. He believed all of this. He was also not sleeping well. He was up before Gus most mornings now, out in the early gray before the sun came over the flat edge of the land, walking the fence lines because it gave him something to do with his body, while his mind moved through the same territory it kept returning to. The territory was simple, and the problem was clear. A person he had come to respect was walking into a situation she had not chosen, and she was doing it with her eyes open and her head level, and her face composed into the expression of someone who has decided to accept what is coming, and there was something in that, in the particular courage of a person choosing to endure something rather than choosing to fight it, that moved something in him that he had not expected to be moved. He had been in his own version of that posture. He knew what it cost. He knew what it asked of a person to hold themselves that still inside something that was not their choosing. He had done it for 8 months in Crane County, and he still felt the shape of it in him sometimes, the compressed and careful quality of getting through something day by day. He had gotten out. He had been fortunate enough and stubborn enough, and he had gotten out. He thought about Nora Calloway 3 weeks from now, standing at the front of the church in Delwood, saying words that would be heard by everyone as a choice, and that were, in the truest sense, not a choice at all. He thought about what it would mean to walk forward from that day inside a life that had been decided for her. He told himself for the last time that it was not his business, and this time even he did not believe it. He went back to the bunkhouse and made coffee in the dark, and sat on the steps and watched the sun come up over the Hargrove land that he knew every inch of, and the sky turned from black to gray to a kind of pale gold that was very beautiful if you were in a position to appreciate beauty. and he sat there and felt the exact weight of the decision that was forming in him. Not a dramatic weight, not a theatrical one, but a real one. The weight of something that he knew was going to require something from him, and that he was not yet sure he had the right to give. He thought about it for 3 weeks. 3 weeks is not a long time when you are comfortable and nothing is at stake. 3 weeks is a considerable period when something is building in you that has no clean resolution and that keeps arriving at the same conclusion, no matter which direction you approach it from. The conclusion was simple. He could not watch this happen and say nothing. He did not know yet what saying something would look like, or what it would cost him, or whether it was something she would want. But he knew that staying quiet in the face of something you have the ability to speak to, simply because speaking is uncomfortable, is its own kind of choice. He had made that choice before, in Crane County, when he had stayed quiet about things he should have said, and the result of that quiet had followed him 400 miles north and still showed up in his sleep sometimes. He was not going to make that choice again. He did not know what he was going to do instead. That was a problem for a person standing closer to the day than he was right now. Right now, the sun was up, and Gus was moving around inside the bunkhouse, and the cattle needed checking, and Cade Renfro stood up from the steps, poured out the last of his coffee, and went to work. With 2 weeks left before the wedding, the conversations behind the stable happened not because anyone planned them, but because the stable was on the path between the house and the south field. And twice in those 2 weeks, Nora arrived at the Hargrove Ranch at a time when Cade Renfro happened to be passing through that same stretch of ground. Neither of them made a point of stopping. Neither of them went out of their way. But they were both people who paid attention. And paying attention in a confined space over a shared period of time has a way of creating its own kind of gravity. The first conversation happened on a Tuesday. Nora had come to drop off some items she had been asked to bring. A set of curtain hooks that Dale needed for a window in the back bedroom, and a jar of preserves that her father was sending as a gesture of goodwill, and a list her father had written of practical questions about the property boundaries that he wanted answered before the wedding date. She carried these things up the porch steps and knocked, and Clara opened the door and took everything, and said that her dad was out but would be back shortly, and would Nora like to wait. Nora said she would wait outside for a few minutes, because it was a good day, and the inside of the house still had the quality, for her, of a place that she was visiting, rather than a place that was hers, and she was not quite ready to sit inside it alone. She went around to the side of the house, where the porch turned into a narrower walkway, and then opened onto the path that ran past the stable. She sat on the fence rail that lined the path, not particularly thinking about anything, watching a hawk circle very high and slow over the east field, in the particular unhurried way hawks circle when they are not hunting yet, just watching. Cade came along the path from the south, carrying a coil of rope over one shoulder and a bag of small hardware in his hand. He saw her on the fence rail, and his pace did not change, but she noticed, and she was someone who noticed things, that there was a small shift in the way he was moving, a slight attentiveness, as though something that had been turned inward had turned outward. He stopped near the stable door. He did not make a show of stopping. He simply stopped, the way people stop when there is a natural pause in what they are doing. He set the bag down on the fence post and began to coil the rope differently, more neatly. 2 more weeks, he said, without preamble. She looked at him. Is that a question? No, he said, just an observation. She looked back at the hawk. 2 more weeks, she confirmed. He worked the rope through his hands. He said, after a moment, how are the preparations going? She thought about how to answer this. She had been asked versions of this question several times in recent days, by people who asked it with a particular brightness that indicated they expected a particular kind of answer. Excited preparations, a woman looking forward to her future. She had given them that answer because it cost the least in terms of what it provoked. They're going, she said to Cade, which was not that answer, and was also not nothing. He understood the distinction. She could tell by the way he didn't push it. Can I ask you something? She said. This was a reversal of the previous week, and she noticed this, and suspected he did too. Yes, he said. Why did you come to Dale Hargrove specifically, when you needed a fresh start? There are ranches in a lot of places. He continued working the rope. I knew someone who'd worked here, he said, told me Hargrove was fair, paid what he said, and didn't make a man feel like he was being watched. Was that important to you, not being watched? At the time, he said, yes. She thought about this. And now? He looked up from the rope. He looked at her in that direct, measured way, the way of someone who has taken in a great deal and selects what to give back carefully. Now, I've been here long enough that not being watched feels like just how things are. I know my place here. What I do matters or doesn't matter, based on whether I've actually done it right, not on whether someone's looking over my shoulder. That's a good way to work. It sounds like a good way to live, she said. It is, he said. She looked at the hawk, which had now dropped lower and was beginning to circle more tightly. Somewhere in the field it had found what it was looking for. I've never had that, she said. I've always had someone looking over my shoulder. She paused. Or ahead of me, deciding what was in front. He set the rope down. He turned so that he was leaning against the fence post rather than working over it. You're 18, he said. Most people that age haven't had it either. Some do, she said. Some people get told early on that their path is theirs. That where they go is their decision to navigate. She paused. I always knew my path was for someone else to set. He was quiet for a moment. That doesn't have to be permanent, he said. She gave him a look that was not unkind, but was very clear. In 2 weeks, I'm going to marry a man I didn't choose, she said, plainly, and go live in his house, and help raise children that aren't mine, on land that will never be mine, in a town where the biggest thing that will ever be said about me is that I was a good wife and I kept things running. Tell me how that path changes. He did not have an immediate answer to this. She had not expected him to. She had said it not to make him feel bad, but because she was tired, she realized, of the slightly softened version of her situation that she had been offering to everyone who asked. She was tired of the tactful framing of it. This was what it was, and she found, in the moment of saying it plainly, a kind of relief. Not resolution, but the relief of a thing accurately named. Cade looked at the ground for a moment. Then he looked at her. I don't know how, he said. I don't have a good answer to that. He paused. But I'll say that people's paths change, in ways they didn't see coming. I know that from my own experience. The thing you think is permanent often isn't. And the thing you think is temporary, she said. Sometimes is, he said. Sometimes becomes the whole rest of your life. He picked up the bag of hardware. I don't say that to be hard. I say it because I think you deserve an honest answer, instead of a comfortable one. She found herself, for the first time in several weeks, feeling something that was not the compressed and careful management of a situation closing around her. It was something smaller and more personal. Something that had to do with being spoken to directly by someone who was not trying to manage her, not trying to arrange her, not trying to make her feel better about something he was not willing to look at squarely. She felt, in that moment, genuinely seen. Not seen as Earl Calloway's practical eldest daughter, not seen as the capable woman who would run Dale Hargrove's household, seen as whoever she actually was, underneath all of that. The person who had sat at her kitchen table with cold oatmeal and thought about the word decent. The person who stood at the window, watching the land that went nowhere, and let herself, just for a moment, want something more than what was available. She got off the fence rail. I should go back and wait for Dale, she said. All right, he said. She walked back toward the house. She did not look back. But she was aware, without looking, that he watched her go, and she was aware that this awareness had a particular quality to it that she was going to have to think about carefully, because it was not like the awareness she had of Dale watching her, which she experienced as assessment, evaluation of suitability, and it was not like the awareness of her father watching her, which she experienced as oversight. It was something else, and she did not have a word for it yet, and she was not sure she should try to name it until she had more information about what it was. The second conversation happened on a Friday, 4 days later. She had not planned to come to the ranch. She had come because Clara had sent word through a mutual acquaintance that she had a question about something in the kitchen, and could Nora stop by when she had a moment, and Nora had stopped by, and the kitchen question had been answered in about 3 minutes, and then Clara had been called outside by Perry about something to do with the horses, and had apologized and gone, and Nora had found herself in the kitchen again, with a cup of tea that had been offered, and that she had not yet drunk. She took her tea and walked outside, rather than sitting in the kitchen alone. He was behind the stable, mending a section of fence board that had cracked along one edge. She came around the corner and nearly walked into him, which was not elegant, and she stepped back and said, "Sorry," and he said, "No, I didn't hear you coming," and they were both standing too close in the narrow space behind the stable, and then they took a step apart, and the awkwardness of the moment resolved itself, with the particular efficiency of two people who are not given to making things more complicated than they need to be. She sat on the upturned crate that was serving as a step near the stable door. He went back to the fence board. He was measuring the new piece against the broken one, which required a certain stillness, and in the stillness, she said, "Clara has been kind to me." He glanced over. "She's a good kid." "She's trying to make this easier," Nora said. "She doesn't have to do that. It's not her job, but she's doing it anyway." "She does things like that," he said. "She sees what needs doing, and does it without a fuss. Like her mother, I'm told." Nora held her teacup. "Do you think he'll be all right? After I'm there?" He stopped measuring. He turned to look at her. "Dale?" "Perry," she said. He considered this. "Perry's got it rough," he said honestly. "He's been the man of the house in his head since Louise died, and Dale lets him be that up to a point, because Perry needed it. But Perry's also 17, and underneath the sulk, he's a decent kid who will eventually figure out that the world isn't his to run." He picked up the fence board. "He'll be all right. He'll take longer than Clara, but he'll come around. I don't want to be the person who takes something from him," she said. He didn't ask for any of this either. This stopped Cade. He put the board down again and looked at her with something that she could not quite classify. Attention of a very specific and focused variety. "You know," he said, "you're the only person I've heard say something like that." "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said carefully, "that most people in your position would be thinking about what this situation is costing them, what they're giving up, what they're walking into. They wouldn't also be thinking about what it's costing a 17-year-old boy they barely know." She looked at him. "He's part of the situation," she said. "You can't only look at the part of a situation that directly involves you." "Most people do," he said. She wrapped both hands around the teacup. It was cooler now, the warmth mostly gone. "I've spent a long time being a part of a situation that other people weren't thinking about," she said quietly. "I know what that feels like from the inside. I don't want to do it to someone else." He looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon was quiet behind the stable, away from the sounds of the main yard. A bird, somewhere in the fence line, was making a small, insistent noise, and then stopping, and then starting again. "Is there anyone who's thinking about what it's costing you?" he said. She considered this, with the same honest attention she gave to everything. "Lily is," she said. "My sister, and Ruth." She paused. "Clara has been. In her way." She paused again. "You have been. In a way." He did not look away. "I have been," he confirmed. It was said plainly, without drama, without anything attached to it that would make it into something it wasn't. It was simply a confirmation of a fact. She looked at the fence board he was mending. "Why?" she said, not provocatively. Just a question she wanted the answer to. He thought about this. He was someone who took his time with answers, and she had learned in the weeks of knowing him slightly that this was not evasion, but precision. He did not want to say more than was true, or less than was true, and finding exactly the right amount was work. "Because you came onto this property on the terms of someone else's arrangement," he said, "and you've been learning everything about it, with the same care and attention you'd bring to something you'd chosen. And because you told my employer's future wife that you hadn't agreed to this because you were certain you wanted it, and you told him where you stood because you didn't see any good reason to begin something with a lie, and because—" He stopped. "Because?" she said. "Because the way you hold yourself when you're inside a situation you didn't choose," he said, "is the most honest thing I've seen in a while. And honesty like that doesn't come easy. It costs something." She was very still. The bird in the fence line had gone quiet. "It does cost something," she said. She looked down at the teacup. "I'm not sure I always know where the cost is going." He picked up the fence board again. "I don't think any of us do," he said. "Not in real time." She stood up from the crate. She set the teacup down on it. "I'm going to go back to the house," she said. "All right," he said. She took a step, then stopped. She did not know why she stopped. Something in the moment had a quality of incompleteness that made moving away from it feel too abrupt. She turned back and looked at him. He was looking at the fence board. He was someone, she thought again, who let things be what they were, without pressing them into shapes they weren't ready for. "Thank you," she said, "for being straight with me." He looked up. "It's the least I can do," he said, and she heard in that, under the surface of its plainness, something that was considerably more than what it said. She walked back to the house. She sat in the kitchen and finished her tea, which was cold now, and Clara came back from the barn with hay in her hair, and Dale came in from the field 20 minutes later, and the ordinary life of the Hargrove household moved around her in its established patterns. And inside Nora something was shifting, quietly and without announcement, the way things shift when you have been held in one position for so long that you have almost forgotten you could be oriented differently. It was not a dramatic shift. It was not a revelation. It was something much smaller and more fundamental. The small, steady awareness that someone was paying attention to who she actually was, and that this awareness had been lacking for so long that she had stopped noticing its absence until it was present. She did not know what to do with this information. She was very clear-eyed about her situation. She was going to marry Dale Hargrove in 10 days, and Cade Renfro worked on the ranch she was marrying into, and none of that was going to change, based on 2 conversations behind a stable. She understood this. She was not someone who confused the presence of a feeling for a license to act on it without thought. But she also knew, in the way you know things that you have not yet said out loud, that what those conversations had done was clarify something for her. Something about what she wanted from a life, what she had a right to want, what it looked like when someone treated her as a person whose inner experience was worth asking about. She wanted to be asked. She wanted to be heard. She wanted to matter to someone in a way that was personal rather than practical. She was 10 days from a life that had been arranged to provide for her practically, and that would not, she was quite certain, provide for her in that other way. She drove home in the late afternoon, and the road between the Hargrove Ranch and her father's house was the same road it had always been, and the land on both sides of it was the same flat, patient, honest land it had always been. And Nora Calloway drove through it, with her hands on the wheel, and her eyes on the road, and all the information she had gathered in the past weeks, moving through her like weather, building towards something that had not yet broken open. She did not know what she was going to do. She knew, for the first time, that there was a question inside that sentence, not what was going to happen to her, but what she was going to do, and that the existence of that question was something new, something that had not been there before those conversations behind the stable, something that felt, in a way she could not entirely account for, like the first small evidence of the power she had been told she possessed. The road ran on. The sun went lower. She drove. The night before the wedding arrived, the way most consequential nights do, not with any particular drama in its own character, but carrying the weight of what was coming so heavily that the ordinary things inside it felt strange. The light was the same. The sounds of the house were the same. The kitchen smelled the same. And yet the whole evening had that underwater quality that comes when you are standing at the edge of one version of your life, and the next version begins at sunrise. Nora had finished everything there was to finish. The small bag she was taking to the Hargrove house was packed and sitting near the door of her room. She had set out her dress, which was simple and good, not a formal wedding dress, because no one had suggested she get one, and no one had offered the money for it, which was fine. She had not wanted one. It was a pale blue dress she had owned for 2 years, that fit her well and made her look clean and put together, which was what the occasion required. She had pressed it that afternoon, and hung it on the back of the door, where it would stay unwrinkled through the night. She had made supper for her family. She had washed the dishes. She had helped Grace with a knot in her hair that Grace had been worrying about for 2 days, and she had sat on the edge of Grace's bed afterward and told her a story. The story about the little horse who lived in a tree, which was a story Nora had invented when Grace was 5, and which Grace could now recite word for word, but still wanted told to her. She had told it slowly and carefully, and Grace had fallen asleep before the end, which was the usual outcome. And Nora had sat there for a few extra minutes in the quiet of Grace's room, with the low lamp on, looking at her youngest sister's face, which in sleep had the total and magnificent peace of a person who does not yet know what is coming. She had gone back downstairs. Her father was in his chair reading something agricultural. Owen was out. Lily was doing something quiet in her room, and had been doing it all evening, which was Lily's way of being present with Nora, without forcing a conversation that neither of them knew how to have. Sam had fallen asleep on the couch with his shoes still on, and the television on low, and Nora turned it off, and put a blanket over him, because he would wake cold at midnight otherwise. She made herself tea. She sat at the kitchen table. She had been sitting at this kitchen table her whole life. She had sat here when she was 5, and could not yet reach the top of it properly, when her mother was still alive, and the kitchen had a different sound to it, a lighter, warmer sound, a sound that included music on the small radio that her mother always kept on the counter, and that her father had put away after Clara Calloway died, and never brought back out. She had sat here at 11, learning to make accounts. At 12, taking over the supper cooking. At 14, taking the phone calls from the feed supplier. At 16, realizing that the college application she was filling out in the notebook she kept behind her mattress might not lead anywhere she could actually get to. At 18, the night after Dale Hargrove came to supper, when she had said, "All right," and heard a door close. Now she was sitting here with tea going cold in her hands on the night before her wedding, and the kitchen was quiet, and the house was settling around her in the way old houses settle, and she was trying to do the things she had been avoiding doing, which was to simply sit inside the truth of her situation, without managing it. The truth was this: she did not love Dale Hargrove. She respected him. She thought he was a serious man, and a fair one, and she believed, based on what she had seen, that he would keep his word, and that he would not be cruel to her, and that the household she was entering was one where her labor would be valued, and her competence respected. She believed that his children, given time, would accept her, and Clara already had begun to. She believed that this marriage would provide for her family in ways that needed providing for, and that her father would sleep better at night for it, and that the younger children would have more stability than they had been heading toward without it. She could see the logic of it. The logic was sound. But she also knew, and this was the thing she had been managing around for weeks, moving past it carefully, not looking at it directly, that a life does not want to be only logical. People do not want to be only useful. The part of her that had spent her whole life being practical, being capable, being steady, being exactly what was expected of her, that part could manage this marriage with grace. But there was another part, one she was only just beginning to locate properly, one that had been coming into focus in the weeks since a young man had asked her plainly how she was doing, and listened to her answer. And that part knew, with a clarity that was not comfortable, and was not manageable, and would not be set aside, that she was about to spend her life in a version of herself that was one layer smaller than what she actually was. That was what she had been refusing to look at. She looked at it now. In the morning she would put on the blue dress, and drive to the church, and walk down an aisle that was not exactly an aisle, because it was just the space between 2 rows of folding chairs in the Delwood First Baptist, and she would stand at the front and say words to Dale Hargrove that would be true, in the sense that she meant to honor them, and the preacher would pronounce them married, and that would be that. And then she would go home to the Hargrove Ranch, and she would open the kitchen cabinets she had already memorized, and she would make supper, and do the things that needed doing, and she would do all of it well, because she had never done anything badly in her life. And the years would follow each other the way they do, and she would be competent and steady and decent, and the town of Delwood would watch her, and nod, the way the town nodded at things that confirmed what it expected. She thought about Cade Renfro. She allowed herself to do this directly, which she had not done before. She had thought around him, thought about the conversations, thought about what had been said. She had not let herself think about him specifically, because she understood that thinking about him specifically, while engaged to marry another man, was a door she had not earned the right to open. But tonight she was sitting in her kitchen on the last night of her unmarried life, and she had been trying for weeks to be honest about everything else, and the omission felt like a hypocrisy she no longer had the energy for. She thought about the way he looked at her, not the way Dale looked at her, which was assessing, reasonable, fair, assessing. Not the way her father looked at her, which was managerial. Not the way the town looked at her, which was categorical. Cade looked at her the way someone looks at a person they are actually seeing, as opposed to a person whose presence serves a function. He looked at her, and she felt looked at, and this was a distinction she had not realized existed until she experienced its opposite every day. She thought about the way he answered questions. He never gave her the comfortable answer, He gave her the accurate one, and when he wasn't sure, he said he wasn't sure. And there was something in that willingness to sit inside uncertainty without papering over it that she found deeply, uncomplicatedly admirable. She thought about standing behind the stable with the cold teacup in her hands, and the bird making its insistent sound in the fence line, and him saying, "The way you hold yourself when you're inside a situation you didn't choose is the most honest thing I've seen in a while." She had carried that sentence around with her for a week. She had not been able to put it down. Not because it was romantic. It was not, particularly. It was direct and plain and careful. But because it was the first time in a very long time that someone had said something to her that was specifically about her, as a specific person, and not about what she was, or what she provided, or what the arrangement required. She set her teacup down. She was going to marry Dale Hargrove in the morning. This was true. She was also, she understood now, in the uncomfortable and irrevocable way of understanding something you can no longer unknow, aware of what she was giving up to do so. Not in the abstract, not in the philosophical sense of the opportunities she was leaving behind, or the paths she was not taking. In the specific sense of a specific person who had talked to her behind a stable and asked her questions no one else had asked, and listened to her answers as though the answers mattered to him personally. She was aware that she might be giving too much weight to too few conversations. She was aware that the particular intensity of her situation might be causing her to attribute significance to things that were simply kindness from a decent person. She was aware of all of this. She was also aware that she had a tendency, built from long practice, to discount her own perceptions in favor of whatever interpretation required the least from her, and that this tendency was not always reliable. She got up from the table. She went to the window and looked out at the dark. The land was flat and invisible, and the stars were there above it, and somewhere in that darkness was the Hargrove Ranch, 4 miles away, where everything she was about to become was already waiting. She thought, "I have spent my whole life understanding what was expected of me. I have never once in my life been asked what I expected of the world." She thought. Lily asked. Ruth asked. Clara asked. Kate asked. She thought, "The people who asked are the people who can see me." She thought about what it would mean to spend the next 30 years being seen by some people and not seen by others, and about how the one who would be closest to her daily life was the one who had not asked, and she let herself feel what that meant, not for a long time, not indulgently, but honestly. She let it be the size it was. Then she took a breath. She put her cup in the sink. She turned out the lamp. She went upstairs, and she stood in the doorway of her room for a moment and looked at the blue dress hanging on the back of the door. And then she looked at the small bag packed on the floor. The bag had in it the things she was bringing to her new life. Some clothes, a few books, the small photograph of her mother that had sat on her dresser since Clara Calloway died, and that she would not leave behind under any circumstance. A seed packet of marigolds, because her mother had always grown marigolds, and Nora intended to as well, wherever she was. These were the things she was taking. They were small. They fit in a bag that she could lift with one hand. She lay down on the bed she had slept in her whole life. She looked at the ceiling. The house was very quiet. Outside, an owl made its sound once and then was quiet. Grace would still be asleep with her peaceful face. Sam would still have the blanket over his feet that she had put there. Lily would be awake in the next room, probably, not sleeping, probably looking at her own ceiling with the same quality of unslept attention. She thought about Lily. She thought about Grace. She thought about what she was doing for them, whether she saw it that way or not. She thought about the younger children's chances with more stability in the family, with the arrangement that this marriage secured. She had not made this choice purely for herself, and she had never pretended she had. She had made it for all of them, in the way that eldest children sometimes make choices for all of them, carrying a weight that the younger ones do not see, because they are too young to understand its shape. That was true. That mattered. But she also thought, and this was the thought she had been resisting most fiercely, the thought that she finally allowed in this last hour of the last night, that there was a difference between making a sacrifice out of love and making a sacrifice that erases you. She had been trying to tell herself these were the same thing. They were not. Love that costs you your whole self is not sacrifice. It is just loss. She did not sleep for a very long time. When she did sleep, she dreamed about nothing she could remember. She woke before the alarm. The room was full of the particular cool gray light of a morning that has not yet decided what it is going to be. She lay still for a moment, in the last moments of the last morning of her life before this changed, and she breathed, and she thought, whatever happens today, I am still this person. Whatever happens today, I will still be this person tomorrow. She did not know, in that moment, what that meant for what was about to happen. She got up. She washed her face. She put on the blue dress. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment, and the face looking back at her was calm and composed and familiar. The face of a person who has decided to be present for what is coming, rather than absent from it. She had always respected that quality in herself, the capacity to be present. She intended to keep respecting it. She went downstairs. Her father was already up, already dressed, already at the table with his coffee and his upright posture. The posture of a man who has made a correct decision and is ready to see it through. He looked at her when she came in and he said, "You look fine," which was the highest register of compliment he gave to personal appearance. She said, "Thank you." She poured herself coffee. She stood at the window one more time, the way she had stood that first morning, watching the land outside in the early light. The dust near the fence line was still. The sky was beginning to turn. Somewhere far off, a truck engine started and then settled into its running sound. She thought, this is the last morning I will stand at this window and call this home. She thought, I don't know what today will hold. She thought, I am not the only one. And that last thought, the understanding that she was not alone in the middle of this, that there were other people in this story who were also walking into a morning they had not fully anticipated, that thought sat with her in a way that was not exactly comforting, but was something close to fortifying, and she held on to it like a rope in the moment before everything changed. She finished her coffee. She set the cup down. She looked at her father, who was reading his agricultural paper, who had arranged the rest of her life before she had known how to ask for something different, who had loved her in the only way he knew how, which was practically, which was managerially, which was by providing what he could provide, and expecting the same in return. She looked at him, and she felt something that she was honest enough to acknowledge was not anger, not resentment, but a kind of grief. A grief for the conversation they had never had, a grief for the questions he had never asked, and that she had stopped expecting him to ask. She did not say any of this. She simply looked at him for a moment, and then she picked up her bag, and she went out to the truck, and she drove toward the church, and the morning opened around her like something that had been waiting a long time. The First Baptist Church of Delwood was a plain building, the plainest on the main street, with white painted walls that always needed another coat, and a wooden floor that creaked in the same 3 spots, no matter how carefully you stepped around them. The folding chairs had been set out in 2 rows of 15 down the center of the room, with an aisle of about 4 feet between them, and the aisle was where Nora walked when she came in through the side door with her father and her siblings, because the front door was for the congregation, and the side door was for the family. She had been inside this church hundreds of times. She had sat in these chairs for Sunday services, and for Easter, and for Christmas, and for the funerals of people she had known since she was small. She had sat here when Louise Hargrove's service was held, 2 years ago, and had watched Dale Hargrove sit in the front row with his 2 children and hold himself with the particular stillness of a man who was keeping himself together by the application of considerable internal force. She had noticed that then, and she had thought it was a good quality, the capacity to hold yourself still in pain. Now she was looking at the same room, from a different position, and wondering what it would look like to hold yourself still in something that was not exactly pain, but was something adjacent to it. The church was full. Delwood turned out for events, partly because there was social cohesion in a small town that made not appearing at a community occasion a statement of its own, and partly because this particular event had the quality of interest that comes when 2 well-known families are joined in a visible way. There were a great many people whose position in Nora's story she had never had occasion to consider, sitting in the folding chairs and talking to each other in the way people talk before services begin, low and continuous, like a river over shallow stones. She walked in through the side door, and the room shifted almost immediately, the talking lowering, and a kind of attention settling over the space that was the attention of a community, for someone it knows well about, to do something permanent. She felt it the way you feel a change in the weather, a physical awareness, a shift in the air. She looked at the front of the room, where the preacher was already standing, and where Dale Hargrove was already standing beside him. Dale was wearing his good suit. She had seen him in it once before, at church. It was dark and well-fitting, and he wore it with the slight stiffness of a man who does not often wear suits and is aware of this. His hat was in his hand. He was looking straight ahead, and then he turned when she came in, and he looked at her, and his expression was the same careful, assessing, not unkind expression it always was, and she thought, "This is an honest man. This is a man who will not lie to me." And she thought, that is something. That is more than some people have. Perry was in the front row on the right side. He was staring at his shoes. Clara was beside him, and Clara looked up and found Nora immediately, and gave her a small, serious nod that contained about 17 things at once, and Nora received it and gave one back. Ruth was 3 rows from the front on the left side. She looked at Nora with the full complexity of a person who loves you and is worried about you, and knows there is nothing they can do, and is going to be here for you anyway, and Nora found this expression more difficult to hold than almost any of the others. She walked to the front. She stood beside Dale. She could feel the room at her back, the weight of the attention, the low shuffling quiet of many people settling into their chairs. Her father was behind her. Her siblings were arranging themselves into the row on the right. The preacher, a man named Howard, who had known her since she was a child, and who had, she suspected, some private reservations about today that were not his place to voice, looked at her with gentle pastoral warmth and said, "Are you ready, Nora?" She said, yes, because she was, in the sense that she was here, and dressed and present, and she had made the decision that had brought her to this moment. Howard began. She stood and she listened, and she breathed evenly, and she was aware of every second of it, with a clarity that she had not expected, not a pleasant clarity, not the clarity of certainty, but the clarity that comes when you are completely present inside something, because you understand that it is happening once, and it is happening now, and you are the only person who is you, and this is the only life you have. Howard talked about the covenant of marriage. He talked about partnership. He talked about the particular challenges of a joining that brings together 2 families, 2 sets of histories, 2 people whose paths had been separate and were now becoming one. He said something true about the way love in a long life grows slowly, the way things grow that have their roots in good soil. She listened to this, and she thought it was true, actually. She thought that was an honest thing to say about love that is built over time, rather than given all at once. She thought she had heard worse descriptions of what she was walking into. Howard was about halfway through the service when he reached the part. She knew it was coming. Everyone who had attended a wedding of any kind knew it was coming. It was one of those elements of ceremony, so established that you ceased, after a while, to hear it as a real question, and heard it instead as a piece of language, a formality, a bridge, between one part of the service and the next. Howard said the words clearly, and with the particular cadence of long practice. If there is anyone present who has reason to object to this union, let them speak now. He paused. In the normal way of these things, the pause lasted about 3 seconds, which is the amount of time established by convention to honor the theoretical possibility of an objection, while making clear that no actual objection is expected. The pause had been going for about 2 seconds when it changed. Something at the back of the room shifted. Not a sound exactly, or not a loud sound. A sound of movement, of a chair, of someone standing. And then a voice, not loud but carrying, the voice of someone who had decided to be heard, and was doing so without drama, without performance, simply as a person who has something to say, and has resolved to say it. "I do," said the voice. The room went so quiet that it seemed to inhale and hold it. Nora turned. Cade Renfro was standing in the last row on the left side. Near the door he had apparently arrived through sometime during the service, in his work clothes, the dark canvas jacket and the boots and the hat that he was holding in his hands. He was not at the front of the room. He had not walked up the aisle. He was simply standing at the back, and the fact that the room was small enough that every person in it could see him clearly made the distance irrelevant. He was looking at her. Not at Howard, not at Dale, at her. And his expression was not an expression of declaration or drama. It was the same expression she had seen on his face every time he looked at her, direct, steady, careful, the expression of someone who has made a decision and arrived at the full weight of it. The silence held. Then it broke. The room erupted, not violently, not in any physical way, but in the vocal, social, immediate way of a community confronted with something it was not prepared for. People were turning, speaking to each other, several voices at once, and somewhere near the front, a chair scraped against the wooden floor. Someone, she thought it might have been Gus, who was sitting near the side wall, actually said, "Good Lord," which was both understandable and imprecise. Earl Calloway made a sound that was not a word. Perry Hargrove's head came up from his shoes. Howard the preacher looked at the back of the room, and then at Nora, and then at Dale, in the way of a man who has been conducting services for 30 years, and has never been required to handle a situation like this one, and is, with considerable dignity, figuring out what to do with it in real time. Cade walked forward, not rushing, not with any quality of aggression. He walked the way he did everything, with that even, precise, unhurried movement that was the outward form of someone who has thought about what they are doing before they start doing it. He walked up the aisle between the folding chairs, and people on both sides turned to watch him pass, and the room was now very quiet again, with a completely different quality of quiet. Not the expectant quiet of a ceremony, but the held breath quiet of something nobody knows the outcome of. He stopped about halfway down the aisle. He did not come to the front. He looked at Dale Hargrove, and his expression was respectful, genuinely respectful. The expression of someone who is not trying to tear something down, but is trying to say something true. And he said, "I'm sorry to do this here." Dale Hargrove looked at him. His expression was hard to read from where Nora was standing. She could not tell whether what was in it was anger or something else entirely. His jaw was tight. Cade looked at Nora. He said, "I know you understand the practical requirements of your situation better than I do. I know you've thought about all of it more than I have, and that you've made this decision with your eyes open. I am not saying you don't know your own circumstances." He paused. "I am saying that I've talked to you twice behind a stable, and in those 2 conversations, I learned more about who you are than people who have known you your whole life seem to know. And I am standing here because I could not sit in this room, in silence, while someone who has never once been asked what she wants is asked to say yes to a question she didn't choose, and say nothing." The room was absolutely still. He said, "I don't know what the right thing is for you. Only you know that. But I know that a life that begins without a choice isn't, it shouldn't be, the only option you have. And I couldn't let this go forward without saying that, whether you want it said or not." He stopped. He stood there with his hat in his hands and the whole town of Delwood behind him, and looked at her. Nora looked at him. She was aware of everything in the room. Her father's silence, which was the silence of a man containing a great deal. Dale's stillness at her side. Clara's face in the front row, which had a quality of fierce and frightened attention. Perry's expression, which she could not read from this angle. Ruth, in the third row, who had both hands pressed flat on her knees. She was aware of Howard the preacher, who had the expression of a man trying to determine whether this was a situation that called for him to intervene, or to stand very still and allow something to resolve itself. She was aware of all of it, with the perfect, terrible clarity of a moment that is happening once, right now, in real time, and that the person inside it is going to carry for the rest of their life. She looked at Cade Renfro standing in the aisle of the First Baptist Church of Delwood in his work clothes, who had arrived here at enormous personal cost. Because she was not foolish, she understood what this would cost him in a town this size, what standing up in someone's wedding and objecting would do to a man standing in a community where your standing was everything, and who had done it anyway. She looked at him, and then she looked at Dale Hargrove, and whatever Dale saw in her face in that moment, it was honest. It was completely, unavoidably honest. She had told him, months ago, that she hadn't agreed to this because she was certain it was what she wanted, and he had said he appreciated knowing where he stood. He was now being given a second and much more public version of that information, and she could see him receiving it with the same steadiness, the same gravity, the same willingness to look directly at a thing that was difficult to look at. The room waited. And in that waiting, Nora understood something she had not expected to understand at this moment. In this place, surrounded by these people, she understood that she had spent weeks trying to determine how much power she had over her own life, and that the answer had been in front of her for longer than she had known where to look for it. Not in the decision about Dale, not in the arrangement her father had made, not in the practical architecture of a situation that had been built around her rather than by her. The power had been in the part of her that had kept being honest when it would have been easier not to. The part that had told Dale the truth in his kitchen. The part that had said true things behind the stable. The part that had, in some small but persistent way, refused to disappear entirely into what was expected. The room had been waiting now for what felt like several minutes, but was probably less than 30 seconds. She turned to Dale. She looked at him with the full honesty she had been practicing. The honesty that had been, for these past weeks, the only thing that was reliably hers in a situation where everything else had been decided by someone else. She looked at him, and she let him see what was there. Dale Hargrove looked back at her. He took a long breath. He looked at the preacher. He looked at his hands, which were folded in front of him, those large, weathered, reliable hands. He looked at Cade Renfro standing in the aisle. Then he looked back at Nora. And the thing he did next, the thing that would be talked about in Delwood for years, that would be discussed in the beauty parlor and at the feed store and after church, that would eventually be described by almost everyone in town as the most decent thing they had ever seen, was that Dale Hargrove set his hat down on the small table at the front of the church, straightened his jacket, and said, in his even and unhurried voice, "Howard, I think we should stop." The room did not erupt this time. The room simply went still, in a way that was different from all the other stills of that morning. A still that contained not shock, but something closer to reckoning. The sound of a community being confronted with the complexity of something it thought it had understood. Howard the preacher blinked. He looked at Dale. He said, carefully, "Dale." Dale said, "I know." His voice was level, not angry, not theatrical. He spoke the way he always spoke, seriously, quietly, with the weight of a man who measures his words before he gives them. "I know what I'm saying." He glanced at Earl Calloway, who was standing behind Nora like something structural, like a wall that does not understand it has a crack in it. Then he looked at Nora again. "I should have asked you something months ago," he said. "I didn't. I told you I'd treat you right, and what I'm doing now is the first honest attempt at that." He picked up his hat. He walked to the side door. He paused there for a moment, and he turned back to look at his children, at Perry, who was staring at his father with an expression of total incomprehension, mixed with something that might, in time, be recognized as respect, and at Clara, who had tears coming down her face, in a completely silent and determined way, and who was looking at her father with an expression that said she understood something that nobody else in the room had quite caught up to yet. Dale nodded to his children. Then he opened the side door and walked out into the morning. The room, for a moment, said nothing at all. Nora stood at the front of the church and looked at the door, where Dale had gone, and then she looked at Cade, who was still standing in the aisle. He was not looking at her with triumph. He was not looking at her with any kind of claim. He was looking at her with the expression of someone who has done what they came to do, and is now entirely uncertain what comes next, and is prepared to sit inside that uncertainty for however long it takes. She heard Earl behind her. She heard him say her name, in the particular low and controlled tone that preceded things she was not going to enjoy, and she turned to look at him. Her father's face was a landscape of contained things. She could not name all of them. She could see the ones nearest the surface. The anger, yes. The embarrassment, yes. The particular bewilderment of a man who had arranged something carefully and has just watched it collapse in public. But underneath those, she could also see something older and less manageable. Something she almost recognized. Something that she thought might have been the thing her father was made of, before the land and the debt and the years of managing things alone had simplified him into practicality. She looked at him and she said, "I'm sorry, Dad." She meant it. She was sorry for the position he was in. She was sorry for whatever this cost him. She was not sorry for the outcome, and she could not be. And she thought he could probably see that too. Because Earl Calloway, for all his limitations as a man who asked his daughter what she wanted, was not a stupid man. He looked at her for a long moment. His jaw worked. Then he turned and he walked toward the door, and her siblings went with him in the quiet, startled way of children following a parent out of something they do not fully understand. And Nora Calloway stood at the front of a half-empty church in Delwood, Texas, in her blue dress, and the morning light came through the east-facing windows, at an angle that fell across the wooden floor in long parallel lines, and she breathed. Ruth reached her first. Ruth came up the aisle fast, and put both arms around her, and said nothing, which was the right thing. Nora let herself be held for a moment. Then she straightened. She looked toward the back of the church. Cade Renfro was still standing in the aisle, about 2/3 of the way toward the front now, and he was looking at her with all the careful, patient, steady attention she had come to recognize as the thing most specifically him in the world. She looked at him. She said, "That was quite a thing to do." "I know," he said. "You're going to have a difficult time in this town for a while," she said. "I know that too," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Around them, the remaining people in the room were beginning to find their way out, moving past them with the slightly stunned and slightly hushed quality of people who have witnessed something they will be talking about for the next 20 years, but are not sure what the right tone for it is yet. "What did you think would happen?" she said. He considered this question seriously, because he was someone who considered questions seriously. "I didn't plan past the moment," he said. "I just knew I couldn't let the moment pass." She looked at him. She thought about the question Lily had asked in the chicken yard. "Is this what you want?" She thought about what she had found at the bottom of that question, on the night she finally asked it properly. A room of her own choosing. A window she had picked herself. A morning that belonged to her. She thought, a man who asks instead of tells. A man who looks instead of past. A morning that began this way. She said, "I'd like to go somewhere and have some coffee, if you're willing. And I'd like to talk properly, without a stable wall and a time limit." He said, "I know a place." She said, "Good." They walked out of the First Baptist Church of Delwood together, into the full-on morning, which was warm and bright and entirely unhurried. And the town of Delwood watched them go with the particular attention that small towns give to things that have just become stories. Dale Hargrove drove out past the edge of Delwood and stopped on the county road, where there was a cattle gate he had put in himself about 14 years ago, when the East Field was first properly fenced. He sat in the truck with the engine off and the window down, and the morning air coming in clean off the land. The gate was wooden and weathered, and had his initials carved low on the left post, put there by Perry when Perry was 6 years old, and had just learned to make the letters. He looked at the gate and at the initials, and at the land beyond it, which was his land, 800 acres of it running east, toward a rise that was not quite a hill, but was the closest thing to one in this part of the county. He sat there for a while. He was aware of what he had just done. He was aware of it completely, without any of the edges of it blurred or softened. He had walked out of his own wedding. He had stopped the service himself, before the vows, before it was completed. He had set his hat on the table, at the front of the First Baptist Church of Delwood, and said stop, in front of everyone he knew and some people he did not particularly know, and Earl Calloway, and a young man who worked for him whose name was Cade, and who had just done, in front of that same audience, the most courageous and probably the most professionally reckless thing Dale had seen anyone do in a good many years. He thought about what Cade had said. He had heard it. He had heard every word of it clearly, partly because the church was small, and the acoustics were good, and partly because the room had gone so completely silent that a voice at the back could have been a voice beside you. He had stood there and listened to this young man say, in plain and careful language, that he could not watch a person be asked to say yes to a question she had never chosen, and say nothing. Dale thought about this for a while. The truth, which he had been carrying for several weeks, and which he had done something about too late, but apparently not too late entirely, was that he had known. Not at the beginning. At the beginning, he had proceeded in the way his generation in this part of the world had learned to proceed, practically, without extensive attention to the internal states of the people involved, which were assumed to be manageable and secondary to the external requirements of the situation. This was not a posture he had invented. It was one he had inherited, and it had served him in many areas of his life, and he had not thought to question it when he went to Earl Calloway's house for supper. He had thought to question it sometime around the third or fourth visit, when Nora Calloway had stood in his kitchen and told him plainly that she was not certain she had chosen this freely, and he had said he appreciated knowing where he stood, and he had meant that. He had genuinely appreciated it. But he had not, and this was the part that was sitting heaviest in him now. He had not done anything with that information. He had received it, and he had been glad to have it, and then he had continued making practical arrangements for a wedding. He had let the conversation matter, and then behaved as though it hadn't, which was a kind of dishonesty, even if it was not an intentional one. He thought about Louise. He thought about her all the time, in the way you think about a person who was the center of your life for 22 years. Not constantly, because life continued and demanded attention, but with a kind of thread running through everything else, the way a river runs through a landscape it has shaped. He thought about what Louise would have said about this situation. He did not have to think very hard. Louise, who was funny and precise, and who made extraordinary lemon cake and organized bake sales with military precision, would have looked at him with the particular look she had reserved for his moments of deliberate self-deception, and she would have said, "Dale, you know better." He did know better. He had known better for 3 weeks, and he had not acted on it. And what had finally acted on it instead was a 24-year-old ranch hand who had come to a wedding in his work clothes and said a true thing at the cost of his own comfort. Dale respected that more than he could easily say. He got out of the truck. He stood by the cattle gate and put his hands on the top rail and looked at his land in the morning light. This was something he did when he needed to think. Not think about anything specific, just think. The land helped him. It was patient, and it was old, and it did not judge him for his mistakes, though it had been the setting for enough of them that it could have made a convincing case. He thought about the arrangement he had made with Earl Calloway. He thought about the practical logic of it, which was real. The Calloway property and the Hargrove property had complementary needs and resources, and the connection between the families had a genuine financial sense to it. None of that was wrong. The arrangement had been reasonable in its practical terms. The problem was that an arrangement with reasonable practical terms had been presented to a person as her life, and she had not been given the tools to refuse it, and she had walked toward it the way she walked toward everything, with her eyes open, with her body straight, with the particular dignity of someone who has decided to meet something difficult without flinching. And it had taken an outsider to walk into a church and say what everyone in that room had known, in the way that communities know things they have collectively agreed not to say. He was not angry at Cade. He wanted to be. It would have been simpler, cleaner. There was a path in front of him, where he got back in his truck and drove to his ranch, and told that boy he was fired, and let the anger carry him somewhere more certain than where he currently was. He could feel the shape of that path. It was available to him. He was choosing not to take it, and the choosing was deliberate. What he was actually feeling was harder to name. It had several layers. There was embarrassment, which was honest and fair, and he accepted it. There was a kind of grief, which surprised him a little, though on reflection it made sense. He had been prepared for a new life, and the new life was not happening. And even when something is not right, its absence requires adjustment. There was something that he eventually identified as relief, which disturbed him more than the other things, because it suggested he had also been carrying knowledge about the situation that he had not been fully honest with himself about. And underneath all of those things there was something else, something he did not have a name for, that was related to the expression on Nora Calloway's face when she turned and looked at Cade Renfro in the aisle of the church. He had seen that expression. He had been standing beside her, and he had turned when she turned, and he had seen her face in the moment before she had a chance to arrange it, before she had time to be what was expected of her. And what he had seen there had been a kind of clarity, a kind of recognition, the expression of a person who has just seen something they did not expect to see, and is completely, utterly unable to pretend otherwise. He had seen that expression on a face before. He had seen it on Louise's face, the very first night he had ever taken her out, when she was 20, and he was 23, and they had driven out to the county road to watch a meteor shower that had turned out to be modest and mostly not worth the drive. And Louise had turned to look at him in the dark, and there had been that expression, that recognition, that thing you cannot manufacture and cannot fake, and that is either there or it is not. He had not produced that expression in Nora Calloway. Cade Renfro had. Dale understood what that meant. He was a man who had been in love, and he knew what it looked like, and he understood that the kindest and most honest thing he could do with that knowledge was exactly what he had done. He had set his hat on the table, and he had said stop. Because whatever Nora Calloway owed to her family's practical requirements, she did not owe Dale Hargrove a life that cost her the expression he had just seen on her face. That was the conclusion he had arrived at. He was standing by his cattle gate in the morning air, And that was the conclusion he had. And it was not a comfortable one, but it was a clear one. And he had always respected clarity, even when it was inconvenient. He heard a truck on the road. He turned to see who was coming. It was Earl Calloway's truck, moving fast, trailing a thin line of road dust. It slowed when it reached him. Earl pulled to the side of the road and got out, and he walked over to the gate, with the posture of a man who has held himself together through something, and is not entirely sure how much longer he can continue to do so. They stood on opposite sides of the gate and looked at each other. Earl said, "I owe you an apology." Dale said, "You don't. My daughter. Your daughter told me, the first time I had a real conversation with her, that she was not certain she was choosing this freely," Dale said. "I went ahead anyway. If anyone owes an apology here, it's me." Earl's jaw worked. He was not a man who received this kind of thing gracefully, the kind of thing that took blame away from someone he had designated as the wronged party, and pointed it somewhere more complicated. "That boy," he said, "working on your property. He did something I should have had the integrity to do myself 3 weeks ago," Dale said. He said it evenly, without heat. He said what was true, in front of everyone, at cost to himself. I respect that. You can disagree with me about it if you want, but that's what I think. Earl looked at him for a long time. The morning air moved between them, carrying dust and the smell of grass, and something that was not quite the smell of the past but was close to it. The smell of a situation that has ended, and has not yet resolved itself into whatever comes next. Earl said, finally, "What happens to the arrangement between our properties?" Dale looked at his gate. He looked at the initials in the low post, his son's 6-year-old handwriting, preserved in wood. He thought about the Calloway land and its needs, and his land and its resources, and about the fact that these were legitimate practical considerations that existed independently of the personal situation, and that they could and would need to be addressed separately, as the practical things they were. "Come by Tuesday," he said. "We'll talk about it properly, separate from everything else." Earl nodded. This was the language he understood, the language of coming by and talking about it properly, of separating things into their respective categories, and dealing with them in their respective ways. He nodded, and he looked briefly at something past Dale's shoulder that was not there, and then he got back in his truck and drove away. Dale stood by the gate for a while longer. He was 51 years old, and he had loved one woman very well, and very long, and had lost her. And he was standing by a gate, with his initials, in the post, in his dead son's 6-year-old handwriting. No, that was wrong. Perry was alive. He meant his son's childhood handwriting. His son when he was 6. His son who was now 17, and who had looked at his father in the church with an expression that Dale needed to go home and address directly, because whatever Perry thought in this moment would matter for the next several years, and needed to be talked about. He thought about going back to his ranch, and to his children, and to the house that still smelled faintly of Louise's dried sage, and that would need, he thought, to find its own smell eventually, the smell of the family that actually lived in it now, rather than the one it kept. He thought about what came next for him, not in a dramatic way, in the plain, straightforward way of a man who has always dealt with things as they were, rather than as he wished they were. He did not know what came next. He was not 23 years old at a meteor shower. He was a man past 50 who was standing on a county road in the morning, having just stopped his own wedding, and who was going to go home now and talk to his children, and then go out and check the cattle, because the cattle needed checking, regardless of what had happened in the church this morning, and then he was going to think about Tuesday. He was going to be all right. He was clear about that, and the clarity was not bravado. He was a serious man, and a steady one, and he had survived the loss of the person he loved most, and that loss had not destroyed him, and neither would this. And the reason in both cases was the same. He knew who he was. He was Dale Hargrove. He paid his debts. He did not raise his voice. He showed up when people needed something. He was decent. And today, he thought, he had been something slightly more than decent. Today he had looked at the expression on an 18-year-old girl's face and chosen her right to it over his own convenience. He got back in his truck. He started the engine. He drove home along the county road, with the windows down and the land on both sides of him patient and vast and ordinary. And he thought about Perry, and he thought about Clara, and he thought about what he was going to say to them both. and by the time he turned through the gate of his own property, he had most of it worked out, which was as much as anyone could ask of a Tuesday morning that had started as a Saturday wedding day. The cattle were where they should be. The hands, Gus and Frank. Cade's chair at the bunkhouse table was going to be empty for a while, he suspected, and he thought he understood why, and he did not grudge it. Went about their work with the particular tactfulness of men who had heard something significant and were giving their employer room. Dale Hargrove fed the horses. He checked the water line. He did the things that needed doing. And when Perry came out of the house at noon, still in his good clothes from the morning, and stood near the barn without saying anything, Dale went over and put his hand on his son's shoulder and said, "Let's go for a drive. I want to talk to you about some things." Perry looked at him. He was 17, and complicated, and had been the man of the house in his own head for 2 years. He also had the eyes of a boy who wanted his father to make sense of something he could not make sense of by himself. He said, "All right," and he got in the truck. They drove out on the county road. Dale talked, and Perry mostly listened. And what Dale said was the truth, which was all he had ever known how to offer his children, and which was, in the end, the only thing worth offering. Back in Delwood, the town was already doing what Delwood always did with significant events: processing it, comparing notes, assigning meaning. The people who had been in the church that morning were the first to speak. By early afternoon, they had been joined by the people who had not been there, but had heard about it from the ones who had. And by the time evening came, the whole town had a version of the story, though the versions varied depending on who was telling them and what that person needed the story to mean. At the beauty parlor, where Ruth was working that Saturday, despite it being a wedding day, because the wedding had been in the morning and she had a 2:30 appointment, the conversation was long and detailed and moved through many rooms of opinion before arriving anywhere conclusive. Ruth said very little. She trimmed the hair of the woman in her chair and listened, and said occasionally that she thought it was complicated, which it was, and that she thought people should probably give Nora some room, which she also thought. At the feed store, where 3 men had gathered around the issue with the particular enthusiasm of people who feel that a male perspective is required and have gathered to provide it, the conversation had a somewhat different character. 2 of the 3 thought that Cade Renfro had done something reckless and disrespectful, and that a hired hand had no place inserting himself into the personal affairs of his employer at the employer's wedding. The third, a man named Walter who was about 65, and who had known Earl Calloway since they were both young, sat on the edge of the counter and said nothing for a while, and then said that from where he'd been sitting in the church, he thought the girl had looked like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time, and that whatever you thought about how it had happened, at least she had put it down. The other 2 men considered this, and eventually changed the subject. At the church itself, Howard the preacher sat in the empty building after everyone had left, and held his own counsel for a while. He had conducted many weddings, and a great many funerals, and 2 situations he had never encountered before, and would not classify, but which he thought of privately as extraordinary meetings. Today was now in that category. He prayed about it in the plain, direct way he had developed over 30 years of ministry, not theatrical, not liturgical, just conversation. And the thing he prayed was not about the people involved but about the capacity for honest action in difficult circumstances, and whether he himself had it, and what it would require. He thought he probably came up a little short. He thought he had let the ceremony proceed further than it should have, in his role as the person conducting it, without stopping to check in with the woman at the front of the room who had not, now that he examined the morning retrospectively, looked entirely like a woman who was where she chose to be. He thought he had been conducting a ceremony rather than paying attention to the people inside it. He locked up the church and walked home and thought about what he might do differently the next time. Clara Hargrove spent the afternoon at the horse fence with Pearl and did not cry anymore, but stayed in the vicinity of the horses because horses did not require her to have any particular opinion about what had happened or to manage anyone else's feelings about it. She had her own feelings about it, which were complex and not fully resolved, and which she suspected would take some time. The clearest feeling she had, underneath all the complexity, was something she was almost afraid to examine directly, because it seemed like the kind of feeling that should be more complicated than it was. She thought her father had done something she was proud of. She thought the expression on his face, when he set his hat down and said stop, was the expression of someone who knew exactly what he was doing, and did it anyway, because it was right. She had seen that expression on his face twice before. Once when he stood up for a man at the feed store who was being badly treated, and once when he told a neighbor the truth about a water rights issue even though the truth was inconvenient. Both times, she had felt this same thing. The recognition of character. She stroked Pearl's nose, and Pearl breathed warm and patient against her palm, and the afternoon went long and gold over the Hargrove land, and Clara thought about Nora, wherever Nora was right now, and she hoped it was somewhere she had chosen. Perry came home from the drive with their father and went straight to his room and stayed there until dinner, which was not unusual for Perry. At dinner he came down and sat across from his father and ate without much comment, and Dale let him, because Dale understood that Perry needed time to work through things in his own way, and that pushing him would produce resistance and not understanding. It was not until they were washing up after dinner that Perry said, without looking at his father, "Did you know, before?" Dale considered this honestly. "I suspected," he said. "I didn't want to know, so I didn't look hard enough." Perry was quiet for a moment. He dried a plate and set it in the rack. "She wasn't going to be happy," he said. "It was not a question." "No," Dale said. "I don't think she would have been. Not the way she deserved to be." Perry dried another plate. He had his father's hands, Perry did. The same breadth across the knuckles, the same particular set of the wrist. He would look more like Dale every year, until eventually he would look exactly like him, the way sons do. "I wasn't going to make it easy for her," he said. "I know," Dale said. "That wasn't," Perry stopped. "That wasn't right either." "No," Dale said. Perry set the plate down. He turned and leaned against the counter in the way of a person who is reaching for something and is not entirely sure they can get to it. "The guy," he said. "Cade." Dale waited. "He's not wrong, is he?" Perry said. It was not quite a statement and not quite a question. "No," Dale said. "He's not." Perry nodded. He picked up another plate and dried it with great care, the way people dry dishes when they are thinking about something else. "What's going to happen to her now?" he said. Dale thought about this. He thought about Nora Calloway in her blue dress, walking out of the First Baptist Church of Delwood into the morning. He thought about what it takes to begin something after you have stopped something that was in motion, and he thought about all the ways it could be difficult. He thought about her father, and the practical situation, and the road ahead that was genuinely uncertain. "I don't know," he said, "but I think she's someone who figures things out." Perry considered this. Then he said, "Yeah," and set the plate in the rack. "Yeah, I think that too." They finished the dishes in a quiet that was the quiet of two people who have talked about a hard thing and arrived somewhere together. And outside the kitchen window the night was coming over the Hargrove land in its usual unhurried way, and Dale looked at the dried sage bundle near the back door and thought that tomorrow he might move it somewhere more permanent. Not put it away, just somewhere that was chosen rather than simply left. He thought that was the right thing to do with it, and he would do it in the morning. Delwood did not fracture quietly. It divided the way small towns divide, loudly in the first 2 days, then in a more organized fashion over the following weeks, and then it settled into the low, persistent argument that would underpin conversations for a long time. The kind of argument that gets surfaced whenever someone in the community does something unexpected, and people need to decide which story they are living in. In the immediate aftermath, the arguments were direct and unpolished, the way arguments are before anyone has had time to refine their positions. Cade Renfro, by the Monday after the wedding, had been the subject of no fewer than 3 distinct conversations at the feed store, 2 at the beauty parlor, 1 at the church vestibule, and several informal encounters of the kind that happen in driveways and parking areas, and at the end of someone's grocery transaction, when they turn around and find their neighbor right behind them with an opinion. The sum of these conversations was that Delwood was divided, and it was divided along lines that were not entirely predictable. The people who were against what Cade had done, and they were numerous and not shy about saying so, argued primarily on grounds of propriety. A hired man did not walk into his employer's wedding and make a scene. Whatever the rights and wrongs of the underlying situation, there was a way things were done, and inserting yourself into someone else's private arrangements was not it. Dale Hargrove had made his decision freely, and Earl Calloway had made his decision freely. And if Nora Calloway had a concern, she should have voiced it before the morning of the wedding, through the appropriate channels, to the appropriate people. This was the voice of order, of established procedure, of the argument that the machinery of social life depends on people not upending it for personal reasons. The people who were for what Cade had done argued on different grounds, and their argument was harder to make because it required acknowledging something that the town had collectively preferred not to examine. What Cade had said, that a person was being asked to say yes to a question she had not chosen, required, as a premise, that the person in question had not been choosing. This implied something about how the situation had been arranged, and who had arranged it, and what that said about how Nora Calloway had been treated by the people closest to her. These were not comfortable things for a community to sit with. They required the community to be a certain kind of honest about itself. Some people were capable of that honesty, and some were not, and the division between the two groups turned out to be more interesting and more revealing than the division over the wedding itself. Ruth fell firmly and immediately in the second group. She had been there. She had seen it happen. She had watched Cade stand up in his work clothes and say a plain thing in a plain voice at enormous personal cost. And she had watched Dale Hargrove set his hat down and say stop. And she had seen Nora's face in the moment after. And she did not have the slightest ambiguity about where she stood. At the beauty parlor, when clients pushed her, and they pushed her, because Ruth was known to be Nora's closest friend, and her opinion was therefore coveted for its intelligence value. She said two things. She said that what Cade did took more courage than most people in this town were likely to exercise in a year. And she said that if people wanted to spend their energy on how it looked, rather than on what it meant, that was their right, but she was going to spend hers differently. This was considered by most of her clients to be a strong position, if an inconclusive one. Earl Calloway said nothing to anyone for 3 days. This was not his usual manner. Earl was not a man who aired his feelings in public, but he was present, reliably, at the places where men in Delwood gathered, and his silence in those places for 72 hours was notable and noted. When he did begin to speak again, which happened gradually over the following week, he did not speak about the wedding, or about Cade, or about Dale. He spoke about cattle and hay prices and the condition of the county roads, which were his usual subjects, and people who knew him well understood that what he was doing was returning to the form of himself that could function, and that everything else was being processed in private. He did not speak to Nora during those 3 days. She was living in their house. Where else would she go? And they moved through the same spaces with the careful non-collision of two people who are not ready to have the conversation they need to have, and have established, without saying so, that this is a temporary state rather than a permanent one. The younger children were subdued around them, reading the atmosphere in the instinctive way that children read adult atmospheres and adjusting their volume accordingly. On the 4th day, Earl came in from the field in the late afternoon and found Nora in the kitchen making supper, as she had been making supper every evening for years. He sat at the table, he poured his coffee, he looked at the table for a while. Then he said, "I'm going to ask you something." Nora turned from the stove. "All right," she said. "Was there anything you wanted?" he said. "Before. Was there something you wanted that I didn't see?" It was such a direct and unexpected question that she was quiet for a moment. She thought about how to answer it. She thought about the college application, and the small scholarship, and the mornings at the window, watching the land. She thought about the part of her that had been forming into something in those weeks, the part that had been clarified by conversations behind a stable, by being asked instead of arranged. "I wanted someone to ask me," she said. "That's all I wanted. I wanted to be asked." Earl looked at the table. The grain of the wood was the same grain he had looked at for 20 years. "I didn't ask," he said. "No," she said. "You didn't." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, a wind had come up and was moving things around in the yard, setting the loose end of the barn door flapping. It needed a new latch, had needed one for months, one more thing on a list of things that were never quite addressed. He sat with his coffee going cold and his hands around the cup, and he said, "I was trying to take care of you." "I know you were," she said. "That's not the same as asking." He absorbed this. He sat with it. He was a man who was not accustomed to sitting with things like this, to letting himself be inside an uncomfortable truth rather than moving directly to the practical response. But he sat with it now, and she could see it cost him something, and she respected him for it. "What do you want now?" he said, "practically speaking." She turned back to the stove. "I want to look into the program at Harston," she said. "The community college. I want to understand what's possible. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, I'll drive you over there this week. She stopped stirring. She turned around and looked at her father, who was sitting at his kitchen table with his bad coffee, and his cracked knuckles, and his 30 years of managing things in the only way he had ever known how to manage them. She looked at him, and she thought about all the ways he was limited, and all the ways he had tried within those limits, and about how those two things could be true at the same time, without either canceling the other out. Thank you, she said. He nodded and picked up his paper, and she turned back to the stove, and neither of them said anything more, and supper was on the table at 6 o'clock, the same as it always was. Cade, meanwhile, was navigating his own version of the aftermath. He had, as he had predicted to Nora in the church, a difficult time in the town for a while. Not every encounter was difficult. Gus, who had worked with him for 3 years, and had a dry, observational quality that tended to assess situations on their merits rather than their appearances, had clapped him on the shoulder when he came back to the bunkhouse on the afternoon of the wedding and said, "Well, I didn't see that coming." And then he had gone inside to make coffee, which was his version of emotional support. Frank had said nothing, which was also Frank's version of support. But at the feed store, on the first Tuesday after, 2 men he knew only slightly had made a point of not acknowledging him, and there was a woman at the church the following Sunday who said something to the woman beside her, when Cade walked past, that he did not catch entirely, but whose intent was clear enough from its tone. He absorbed these things with the evenness of someone who had decided, before he did what he did, that there would be a cost, and that he was willing to pay it. He had not spoken to Nora since they walked out of the church. They had gone to the diner at the edge of town, the one place open on a Saturday morning, and they had sat across from each other in a booth with coffee that was better than the church coffee, and had talked. The talking had been good. It had been the kind of conversation that 2 people have when they have been circling something for a while, and have finally gotten close enough to speak about it plainly. He had told her about Crane County. Not the parts that were shameful. Those were things for a different day, for a time when more had been established between them, but the shape of it, the getting out of it, the coming to Delwood and the 3 years of learning to be someone he could live with being. She had listened with the focused attention she gave to everything, and she had asked 1 or 2 questions that cut directly to the things that mattered, and he had answered them honestly. She had told him what she wanted, the morning with her own choosing, the window she picked herself, someone who asked her instead of telling her. She had said these things plainly, in a diner booth on a Saturday morning, with her blue wedding dress still on, because she had nothing else to change into, and he had listened to each one. He had said, "All of those things seem right to want." She had said, "I know they are. I just hadn't given myself permission to want them properly until recently." He had said, "What changed?" She had looked at him across the booth and said, "Someone started asking." He had understood what she meant by that. He had not made a great deal of it in the moment, because she did not need him to, and because both of them understood that they were at the beginning of something, which is different from being in the middle of it, and that the beginning requires care and patience, and the willingness to let it be what it is, rather than what you want it to be. He had driven her home. She had gotten out of the truck and he had said, "I'll be around," and she had said, "I know," and she had gone inside. He did not see her again for 2 weeks, not because anything prevented it, but because 2 weeks was what the situation needed. Space for things to settle, for Earl to work through what he was working through, for Delwood to do its processing, for the air between everything to clear enough that what came next could be seen properly. He did not press it. He was someone who had learned to let things breathe. He went back to work. Dale Hargrove, when Cade came to the ranch on Monday morning, looked at him for a moment and said nothing, for long enough that Cade was not entirely sure what was coming. Then Dale said, "The south line needs checking. Water pressure was off yesterday." And that was the whole of the conversation about the wedding, and about what had happened, and about what came next between them. Cade understood this as the full and complete resolution it was. He checked the south water line. He found the problem, and he fixed it. He did his work. Over the following weeks, something changed in his working life, though he could not have described it precisely. It was not that the job was different, or that the property was different. It was something in him, a quality of settledness that he had been working toward for 3 years, and had always been approaching but never quite arriving at. He thought it was the settledness of someone who has done a hard thing and come out the other side, knowing that they were, at the core, the person they were trying to be. That kind of knowledge, once you have it, changes the way you stand in the world. It changes what you are willing to do and what you are not willing to do, and it changes the quality of the ordinary days around it. He was still up early, still walking the fence lines in the gray mornings, still paying attention to the land and the cattle and the things that needed doing, but the running thought that had occupied him through the weeks before the wedding, the circular and uncomfortable movement of his mind over the question of what he was going to do, was quiet now. The question had been answered. He had done what he was going to do. What came next was whatever came next. He thought about Nora. He was honest about this. He had been honest about it since the day he understood he was going to walk into that church, and he had no intention of stopping being honest about it now. He thought about her with the deliberate, considered attention of someone who understands that the thing they are thinking about is real, and has weight, and is not a small thing. He thought about the conversations, and the particular quality of her attention, and the way she said things plainly, when plainness was what was needed. He thought about the blue dress, and the diner booth, and the 2 weeks of settled waiting. He thought about what it would take to build something, properly, from where they were. He thought about the patience required, and the time required, and the ordinary difficulty of it in a small town, where everyone knew everyone, and nothing was private, and the gossip would have its own life for years. He thought about all of that, and he found that none of it was the size he had expected it to be. It was all manageable. All of it was things he was willing to do. On a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the wedding, he drove the 4 miles to the Calloway place and parked at the road and walked up to the porch and knocked. Lily answered. She was 14 and had the sharp cheekbones and reading eyes of someone who sees more than is said, and she looked at him for a moment, and then she said, "She's in the back." She said it without hostility, without particular warmth, with the exact neutral assessment of a person who is observing and has not yet concluded. He took it as an invitation and went around to the back. Nora was at the fence watching the cattle, the way she sometimes watched them when she was thinking. She heard his footstep on the dry ground and turned, and she looked at him the way she always looked at him, directly, steadily, with the full awareness of someone who does not practice being unaware. She said, "You drove all the way over here." He said, "I did." She turned back toward the cattle for a moment. The evening was going gold around them. The air was cooler than it had been, the first real suggestion that summer would eventually be persuaded to leave. She said, "My father is driving me to Harston on Saturday to look at the community college program." "Good," he said. "It'll be a lot to manage," she said. "Practically speaking, I don't know yet how it works out. Things that are worth doing usually take some working out," he said. She looked at him over her shoulder. "You're not wrong." He leaned on the fence post. He looked at the cattle, which were doing the slow, patient thing that cattle do in the late afternoon. He said, "How are you doing? With all of it?" She turned to face him properly. She considered the question with the care she gave to questions she was taking seriously. Then she said, "I'm doing better than I was. I'm doing something I haven't done in a long time." "What's that?" he said. "Wondering what's next," she said. "Looking forward, instead of just managing what's in front of me." He nodded. "That's a good thing to be doing." "It is," she said. "It feels different." She paused. "Will you stay for supper? I'm going to ask you, because that seems like the right way to do it. I'm not going to assume." He almost smiled. "Yes," he said. "I'll stay for supper." She nodded and turned toward the house, and he fell into step beside her, and they walked across the dry yard in the late afternoon light, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and in the quiet between them was everything that was not yet said, and not yet decided, and still entirely open, which was uncomfortable, and uncertain, and entirely, absolutely, the right place to be. 2 years is enough time for most things to settle. It is enough time for a town to process its argument and arrive at a majority position that may not satisfy everyone, but is livable for most. It is enough time for the people directly involved in something to understand the distance between what happened and what it meant, and to begin building on the ground that was cleared. It is enough time for a person to start something they were afraid they would never start, and to find out what they are made of when they are choosing instead of being chosen. Nora Calloway spent those 2 years becoming herself, at a rate and with an intensity that surprised even people who had always thought she was remarkable. She enrolled at Harston Community College in the autumn. She drove herself there 3 days a week, 40 miles each way, on roads she came to know so well that she could have driven them without looking. She studied business administration because it was practical, and because she had already been doing a version of it her whole life, and wanted to understand the formal structure underneath the instinct she had always operated on. She was a good student, not the way that students are good when they are afraid to be otherwise, but in the way that students are good when they find that the material they are studying is the material their mind has been waiting for. She sat in classrooms with people who were younger and older and every variety of differently situated, and she listened and she asked questions, and her professors learned quickly that when Nora asked a question, it was worth pausing for. She made a friend in her first accounting course, a woman named Bev, who was 38 and returning to school after 12 years at home raising children, and who had the quality of someone who had been delayed by life and was now making up for the delay with absolute thoroughness. Bev and Nora studied together on the days between classes, sometimes at Bev's house and sometimes at the library in Harston. And Bev was one of the first people Nora had known who asked her opinion about things as a matter of course, as the natural baseline of a friendship, without it being notable. She kept running the Calloway household because it still needed running, though with a different arrangement. Her father, who had driven her to Harston on that first Saturday, and who had walked around the campus with her and looked at the information boards and asked several practical questions of the admissions officer, had restructured things in the months after the wedding, in ways that were small and significant at the same time. He hired a woman from town, Mrs. Petrie, who had done housekeeping for several families, and who had no particular opinion about the Calloway situation, beyond finding the work suitable, to come 3 days a week and handle the domestic things that Nora could not be there for on her school days. He put Owen in charge of the morning animal feeding, which was an overdue elevation of responsibility for a 17-year-old boy. He reorganized, in short, in the way that a practical man reorganizes when the original arrangement has turned out to be wrong, which is systematically, and without excessive commentary, on the original error. He did not apologize to Nora again after that first conversation. That was not his way. But he paid attention differently. She noticed it. It was a small shift in the angle of his attention. He asked her, now, about her courses, about what she was learning. He asked in the brief and factual way of someone who is practicing something new and has not yet developed fluency in it. But he asked. She answered. They were building something between them that was slow and imprecise, and not sentimental, which was the right shape for it. Cade Renfro continued working on the Hargrove Ranch. He and Nora drove back and forth along the road between Delwood and Harston, and various other points, on a schedule that was initially composed of dinners and afternoons, and the occasional long drive on Sundays, when neither of them had a pressing obligation. And that became over time less scheduled, and more simply how they spent their time, the way things become when they are becoming natural, rather than deliberate. He asked her things. This was fundamental to everything. He asked her what she was thinking about, what she was reading, what she made of the things she was learning in her accounting course, what she wanted the year to look like, what she was worried about, and what she wasn't. He asked in the same way she had first noticed him asking, with genuine interest in the actual answers, without an agenda for what the answers should be. She had been looked at her whole life by people who needed her to be a particular thing. He looked at her, and found out what she was instead. She asked him things too. She asked about Crane County, gradually, over months, in the way you ask about something that matters, when you are building the kind of trust that allows for difficult material, he told her. Also gradually, in the way you tell things, when you have carried them long enough, that telling feels both necessary and manageable. What he told her was not simple or flattering, and he did not tell it as though it were. He told it as what it was, a period of his life in which he had made choices he was not proud of, and had spent a long time afterward, understanding why he had made them, and deciding he would not make them again. She listened with the focused, non-judgmental attention she gave to everything, and she asked the questions that needed asking, and did not ask the ones that didn't. And when he was done, she said, "That took a lot of work to become who you are now." He had looked at her. He had said, "You too." They talked about the wedding. They did not avoid it, because avoidance was not something either of them was inclined toward, but they also did not return to it constantly, because it was the beginning of the story and not the whole of it. What they said about it, when they talked about it, was honest and occasionally uncomfortable and always clarifying. She said once that she had been afraid, in the church, that he had come for his own reasons, that he had walked into the church because of what he felt, not because of what was right for her. He had said, both things were true. I came because I couldn't watch what I was watching. I also came because I felt what I felt. Those things were inseparable. I can't claim it was pure. She had appreciated this answer more than a cleaner one would have given her. She had said, I know. That's why I believed it. He had thought about this for a while, and then he had said, when do you think you knew what it was? In the church. She had said, when you looked at me, and not at him. He was my future, and he was standing right there, and you looked at me. Dale Hargrove met Tuesday the way he said he would, and then he met other Tuesdays, and by the third meeting, he and Earl Calloway had worked out a practical arrangement about the land that served both properties. It was not the arrangement that the marriage would have created. It was a smaller and more precise arrangement, a grazing agreement with a clear accounting on both sides, and it did what it needed to do, without requiring anything from anyone's personal life. Both men understood that this was better than what they had been trying to build before, and neither of them said so, because that was not how they talked. Dale, in the 2 years since, had been the version of himself that he had always been, and also, occasionally, and increasingly, something slightly more. He had gone to 2 dances at the community hall, which was not something he had done in years. He had, on the suggestion of Mrs. Petrie, who worked at his house 3 days a week, and who was a woman of strong opinions, attended a dinner in Harston with a group of agricultural landowners that included 2 women he found interesting to talk to. He had not pursued anything from these encounters, and was not ready to, and he was honest with himself about this. But he had started going, which was a different thing from where he had been. Perry, who was now 19, and working the ranch full-time, while finishing his education through correspondence, had become, and this still occasionally surprised Dale, one of the more thoughtful people he knew. Not thoughtful in the way of someone who had always been that way, but in the way of someone who had been forced by circumstances to examine things he would have preferred not to, and had come out the other side of the examination with a more precise understanding of the world. He had knocked on Nora's door about 3 months after the wedding, alone, without telling his father, and he had said something along the lines of, I was going to be rotten to you before. I want you to know I know that. Nora had said, I know. You were scared. Perry had said, that's not an excuse. She had said, no. But it's a reason. Reasons matter. He had thought about this, and then said, you're all right, Nora, which was the highest compliment a person with Perry's reserve could give, and she had understood it as such. Clara Hargrove, who had decided by the age of 16 that she was going to be a veterinarian, and had communicated this to her family in the same tone of settled certainty with which she had told her father that Pearl was not too old to ride, was pursuing this objective with the organized efficiency of someone who had decided a thing and does not see the value in not pursuing it. She and Nora sent letters, real letters, not short messages, long, detailed, cross-hatched letters of the kind that people write when they have things to say, and find that saying them in writing allows for more precision than saying them in person. Clara wrote about Pearl, and about her coursework, and about a boy she was trying to decide what to think about. Nora wrote about her accounting class, and about Bev, and about what she was learning, which was more than accounting. Their correspondence had become one of the more reliable and pleasing features of Nora's life. Howard the preacher had changed the wording of the standard ceremony. He had added a question, not the theatrical one, not the, if anyone objects, which he now understood was a formality so established it had ceased to mean anything, but a quieter one, directed at the couple themselves, midway through the ceremony, asking each person to confirm that what they were agreeing to was freely chosen. He had done this without making a production of it. He had told his congregation what he was doing, and why, in plain terms, and there had been a brief discussion about it that had been largely supportive and occasionally complicated, and then they had moved on, because that was what congregations did. He did not know if it was enough. He thought it was more than what he had done before. The wedding of Nora Calloway and Cade Renfro happened on a Saturday morning in late October, 2 years and 3 weeks after the first one. The day was cool, and the light had that particular quality of late autumn in that part of the country, clean and honest, without any of summer's opacity, the kind of light that shows things as they are. The church held everyone Nora had invited. She had issued the invitations personally, which took some time and was done with care. Some people were not invited, and this was noted, and she understood that it would be. Some people who were not invited came anyway, because that is what people do in small towns when there is an event of interest, and she had expected this and made peace with it beforehand. Ruth was there. Bev was there, having driven from Harston with her husband and their youngest child, who sat impeccably still during the ceremony, and then immediately began to climb the pew the moment it was over. Lily was there, in the 4th row, wearing a dress that their grandmother had once worn, and that suited her. Owen and Sam and Grace were there. Earl Calloway was there, in his good clothes, seated in the 2nd row, looking at the front of the church with the expression of a man who is attending something he may not have fully pictured when it was first explained to him, but has decided, having arrived, that it is all right. Dale Hargrove was there. He sat in the 2nd row on the opposite side, at Nora's specific and private request, which she had delivered to him personally when she drove out to the Hargrove Ranch 3 weeks before the wedding, and knocked on the door, and sat in his kitchen and asked him. He had looked at her and said he would be honored, and she had believed him, and he had meant it. He sat in his place, with his hat on his knee, and his hands folded, and watched the proceedings with the careful, serious attention he gave to everything important. Gus was there, in a jacket that did not entirely fit him, and that he was visibly relieved to remove the moment the reception started. Frank was there, sitting beside Gus, clean-shaved for the first time anyone could remember, which had generated a small amount of quiet comment in the pew. Howard the preacher said his added question when he reached it, and both Nora and Cade answered it clearly and without hesitation, and the confirmation of free choice sounded in the church the way true things sound, without echo, without drama, settling directly into the room. Nora and Cade said their words to each other. The words were the traditional words, the words that had been said in that building by many people over many years, but they had the quality, in this saying of them, of belonging specifically to these two people in this specific moment, not borrowed, not performed, but inhabited fully by the people speaking them. She looked at him when she said them. He looked at her. Afterward, outside, in the cool October light, there was the ordinary and irreplaceable chaos of a small-town gathering after a ceremony. People talking, children running. Someone had brought food that had not been requested but was welcome. Gus was already holding what appeared to be a glass of something stronger than lemonade, and looking much more comfortable than he had inside. Grace found Nora immediately, and wrapped herself around Nora's waist, with the total commitment of a 9-year-old, expressing an emotion that does not have a more restrained version. And Nora held her, and looked over Grace's head, at the gathering of people, who were her life, in its actual form. Imperfect, complicated, warm, and real. Earl walked over. He shook Cade's hand, which was brief and firm, and said everything Earl was capable of saying about what he thought of his daughter's husband. Then he looked at Nora, and he said something she had not expected him to say, which was, "Your mother would have been glad today." She looked at her father. She thought about Clara Calloway, who had kept a radio on the counter, and had always grown marigolds, and who had loved her family in a way that included asking them what they wanted. She thought about her mother's laugh, which she could still hear in the particular register of memory that preserves things beyond the reach of ordinary time. Yes, she said, she would have. Earl nodded. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder, and then turned and went to where Owen was standing, and began to talk about something practical, because that was how he moved through the world, and that was all right. She stood in the October light and looked at her life, not at the future, which was uncertain and would require navigation, and would contain difficulty, as all lives do. Not at the past, which was what it was, and had made her what she was, and could not be, other than what it had been. She looked at the present moment, which was this courtyard, these people, this man, who had walked into a church in his work clothes, and said a true thing at cost to himself, and who was currently listening to Bev describe her correspondence accounting program, with an expression of genuine interest. She had, she thought, the things she had found at the bottom of that question. A room she had chosen, a window she had picked, a morning that would belong to her, someone who asked instead of told. These were not small things. She had been treating them as small things, in the years of not asking for them, because it was easier to manage a desire when you told yourself it was modest. But they were not small. They were the foundational things, the things without which everything else was built on something that would not hold, and she had them now, and she intended to keep them. She went over to where Cade was standing, and she stood beside him, and Bev nodded at her, with the particular nod of a person who is glad something turned out the way it turned out, and the October light went long and golden across the courtyard, and the voices of the people she loved moved around her like weather. In the evening, after everyone had gone home, she stood at a window in the house she had chosen. A small house on the edge of Delwood that they had rented with the intention of saving towards something permanent, and she looked out at the darkening land. Cade was in the kitchen behind her, making something with the focused economy of movement that she had loved about him from almost the beginning. The house smelled of coffee and the dried marigolds she had hung from the kitchen beam, because she had grown them all summer in a row of pots along the south wall, and she had not wanted them to end when the season did. She stood at her window in her house, and she thought about nothing in particular, and everything at once. The way you think at the end of a day that has been the size this one was. She thought about all the people who had brought her here, the ones who had constrained her, and the ones who had asked her, and the ones who had stepped forward at cost to themselves, and the ones who had, in their own time and in their own way, done the thing that was hardest and most right. She thought about all the versions of herself that had existed along the way. The girl in the chicken yard being asked a question she couldn't answer yet. The woman in the church, turning at the sound of a voice at the back of a room. The person who had driven to Harston 3 times a week and built something from what she found there. She thought about what it means to be seen. Not managed or arranged or provided for or assessed or categorized or expected to be useful. Seen. As a person with an interior life that matters. With a question inside her that has a right to be asked and answered. With wants that are neither small nor unreasonable, with the full and specific weight of a self that belongs entirely to itself. This, she thought, is what it is. This is what it feels like. Behind her, Cade said her name. Not urgently, just the way you say a name when you want to include someone in whatever you are doing. She turned from the window. He was holding 2 cups of something warm, and he was looking at her with that direct, steady, careful attention that was the thing most specifically him, and that she had come to understand was one of the primary conditions of her happiness. She crossed the kitchen and took her cup and stood beside him, and the house settled around them in the early dark, and outside the window the land was the same land it had always been, flat and patient and honest about what it was, but she was standing inside it differently now, on ground she had chosen, in a life she had claimed, with the full and settled understanding that this was what was supposed to have been possible all along. And it was enough. More than enough. It was everything.